The year is 1588, and Europe trembles on the edge of religious and political upheaval. As you settle into your bed tonight, let your mind drift back to a world where wooden ships rule the seas, where kings claim divine right to rule entire continents, and where the fate of nations hangs upon the whims of wind and weather. Picture, if you will, the sprawling Spanish Empire of Philip II. From his austere palace of El Escorial, built like a monastery of gray granite in the mountains outside Madrid, this most Catholic of kings surveys dominions that span the globe. The sun never sets on Philip's realm, from the silver mines of Peru to the spice islands of the Philippines. From the Netherlands in the north to Naples in the south, Spanish banners flutter in every wind. Mexico pours forth its treasures of gold and silver into Spanish coffers, while Spanish galleons lumber across the Atlantic heavy with the wealth of the New World. Philip himself is a pale, thin man in his 61st year, dressed always in black, spending long hours in prayer and longer hours bent over the endless stream of documents that flow to his desk from every corner of his empire. He signs each paper with meticulous care, for he trusts no one completely with the governance of his vast dominions. His enemies call him the Spider King, sitting at the center of a web that stretches across the known world, manipulating the threads of politics, religion, and war with calculating precision. Yet even this mighty monarch faces challenges that would break lesser men. In the Low Countries, Dutch rebels have been fighting Spanish rule for 20 years now, their Protestant faith fueling a determination that Spanish steel cannot break. Each year, Philip pours millions of ducats into the military campaigns of the Duke of Parma, his brilliant nephew who has reconquered much of the southern Netherlands but cannot crush the stubborn northern provinces. The Dutch have learned to use their landscape as a weapon, opening dikes to flood the land, retreating behind networks of canals and fortified cities that swallow Spanish armies like quicksand. But it is England that truly vexes the Spanish king. That small, cold island across the Channel has become a thorn in Philip's side that festers with each passing year. Once, he had been married to England's Queen Bloody Mary Tudor, who had briefly restored Catholicism to the realm and burned heretics at the stake with righteous fervor. When Mary died childless in 1558, Philip had even proposed marriage to her younger sister Elizabeth, thinking to keep England safely within the Catholic fold through matrimonial diplomacy. Elizabeth had refused him, of course. The red-haired daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn had chosen a different path entirely. For 30 years now, she has ruled England as the Virgin Queen, unmarried and seemingly untouchable, transforming her kingdom into a haven for Protestant refugees from across Europe and a launching point for attacks against Spanish interests worldwide. The religious divide cuts deeper than mere politics. To Philip, Elizabeth is not just a heretical queen but a bastard usurper with no legitimate claim to the English throne. The Pope himself has declared her excommunicated, her subjects released from all oaths of loyalty. In Catholic eyes, the true Queen of England is Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, great-granddaughter of Henry VII, whose claim to the English throne runs through legitimate bloodlines untainted by her great-uncle's marital adventures. For 19 long years, Mary Stuart has been Elizabeth's prisoner, confined in a series of English castles and manor houses, a living symbol of Catholic legitimacy that Elizabeth dare not release but cannot bring herself to execute. Mary's very existence is a constant threat to Elizabeth's security, for every Catholic plot against the Protestant queen eventually leads back to the captive Scottish queen. The execution changes everything. On a cold February morning in 1587, in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary Queen of Scots walks to the block with the dignity of a martyr. She wears crimson velvet, the color of martyrdom and of the Sacred Heart, and when the axe falls twice to sever her head, Catholic Europe recoils in horror while Protestant England celebrates deliverance from a mortal threat. Philip receives the news in the Escorial, in his small study lined with maps and religious paintings. For a long moment, he sits motionless, his pale hands folded on the polished surface of his desk. Then he reaches for his pen and begins to write orders. The enterprise of England, long discussed and planned but never quite implemented, will now become reality. Elizabeth Tudor has gone too far. The time for half measures and diplomatic protests has passed. But religion is not the only source of conflict between Spain and England. Elizabeth's sea captains have been waging an undeclared war against Spanish commerce for decades now. They call themselves privateers, carrying letters of marque that give their piracy a thin veneer of legality. But to Spanish eyes, they are nothing more than English pirates grown fat on stolen Spanish gold. Francis Drake leads this pack of sea wolves. Drake the circumnavigator, Drake the destroyer, whom the Spanish call El Drac, the dragon. In 1572, he had captured an entire Spanish treasure train on the Isthmus of Panama, seizing silver worth more than Elizabeth's entire annual revenue. In 1579, he had sailed his ship the Golden Hind through the Strait of Magellan and up the Pacific coast of South America, taking Spanish towns and ships completely by surprise, for no enemy had ever before appeared in what the Spanish considered their private lake. Drake's greatest affront came just last year, in 1587, when he sailed boldly into the harbor of Cadiz itself and burned or captured dozens of Spanish ships preparing for the great invasion of England. Singeing the King of Spain's beard, Drake called it with typical English irreverence, but to Philip it was an intolerable insult delivered at the very heart of Spanish naval power. Other English captains follow Drake's example with enthusiastic ruthlessness. John Hawkins makes a fortune carrying African slaves to Spanish colonies, breaking Spain's monopoly on the Caribbean trade. Martin Frobisher seeks the Northwest Passage to Asia but settles for raiding Spanish settlements when geography proves uncooperative. These men and dozens like them have turned the Atlantic into a hunting ground where Spanish treasure ships and merchant vessels sail in constant fear of English attack. The economic impact is staggering. Spanish records show that English pirates capture or destroy Spanish shipping worth millions of ducats each year. More importantly, they disrupt the flow of American silver that Philip desperately needs to finance his European wars. The silver of Potosi, that miraculous mountain of ore in the Bolivian highlands, should flow smoothly from the mines to Spanish coffers. But English interference turns the stream of wealth into an uncertain trickle. Elizabeth's position in all this piracy is deliberately ambiguous. Officially, she maintains that she cannot control her subjects' private ventures on the high seas. Unofficially, she invests her own money in these privateering expeditions and takes her share of the profits when they return laden with Spanish treasure. When Philip's ambassadors protest these thefts, Elizabeth's ministers respond with elaborate legal arguments about freedom of the seas and the rights of merchants to trade where they will. The diplomatic dance grows ever more complex and bitter with each passing season. Philip's ambassador in London, Bernardino de Mendoza, spends years trying to negotiate some accommodation, some way to restore peace between the two crowns without loss of Spanish dignity. But Mendoza is also a spymaster, secretly coordinating Catholic plots against Elizabeth's life and rule. When one such conspiracy is discovered in 1584, Elizabeth expels the Spanish ambassador entirely, cutting the last formal diplomatic link between the two kingdoms. Now there is no one to speak for moderation, no voice to counsel restraint on either side. English attacks on Spanish commerce increase in frequency and audacity. Spanish support for Catholic rebels in Ireland becomes more open and systematic. Both kingdoms begin preparing for a war that seems as inevitable as the tides. In Ireland, Spanish gold and Spanish weapons flow to Celtic chieftains who dream of throwing off English rule and restoring the old Catholic faith. The rebellion of the Earl of Desmond in Munster has been crushed, but at terrible cost in English blood and treasure. Elizabeth's armies have learned the bitter lessons of guerrilla warfare in the Irish bogs and forests, where Spanish-trained rebels strike from ambush and vanish like ghosts into the mist. The Netherlands provide another battleground for this undeclared war. Elizabeth sends money and troops to support the Dutch rebels, while Philip's armies under the Duke of Parma systematically reconquer the southern provinces. The ancient cities of Flanders, Bruges, Ghent, Brussels, Antwerp, fall one by one to Spanish siege warfare, their Protestant populations fleeing northward or submitting to Catholic restoration. But the northern provinces hold firm behind their water barriers. Amsterdam grows rich on the carrying trade of Europe, Dutch ships penetrating markets once monopolized by Spanish and Portuguese merchants. The United Provinces, as the rebel states style themselves, have created something new in European politics, a republic governed by merchants and sustained by commerce rather than by royal bloodlines and aristocratic privilege. Elizabeth's support for these rebels is another source of Spanish grievance. In Philip's eyes, the Dutch are his subjects in rebellion against their rightful sovereign, and Elizabeth's aid to them is nothing less than an act of war. When she accepts the title of Protector of the Netherlands in 1585 and sends an army under the Earl of Leicester to fight openly alongside the Dutch, Philip decides that the time for patience has finally ended. The English, for their part, see Spanish power as an existential threat to their independence and their faith. They remember the burnings of Mary Tudor's reign, when Protestant martyrs died screaming in the flames at Smithfield. They know that Spanish armies have crushed Protestant resistance in the Netherlands with systematic brutality. They fear that Catholic victory in Ireland will provide a backdoor for Spanish invasion of England itself. Moreover, the English have discovered something intoxicating about their new role as challengers to Spanish supremacy. Drake's circumnavigation has proven that English seamanship can match any in the world. English cannon are proving superior to Spanish guns in the practical test of battle. English ships, built for speed and maneuverability rather than sheer size, are outfighting the great Spanish galleons in encounter after encounter. The wealth flowing into English coffers from privateering expeditions is transforming the kingdom's economy and awakening English ambitions that would have seemed fantastic just a generation earlier. Why should Spain alone profit from the riches of the New World? Why should English merchants be barred from the markets of Asia and America? The old order that divided the world between Spain and Portugal is cracking under pressure from new maritime powers that refuse to accept their exclusion from global commerce. Elizabeth herself embodies this new English confidence. At 54, she has survived every challenge to her rule: Catholic plots, parliamentary opposition, the threats of foreign invasion, the personal trauma of sending her cousin Mary to the block. She has learned to balance competing factions at court with consummate skill, playing Catholics against Protestants, nobles against commoners, hawks against doves, keeping all parties dependent on her favor while never fully trusting any of them. Her court at Whitehall and Greenwich has become a glittering center of Renaissance culture, where poets like Edmund Spenser celebrate England's imperial destiny, where playwrights like Christopher Marlowe explore the psychology of power and ambition, where musicians and artists compete for royal patronage and aristocratic favor. The Queen herself is the greatest performer of all, creating a cult of personality around her unmarried state that transforms potential weakness into mystical strength. But beneath the glittering surface of Elizabethan court life lies constant awareness of mortal danger. England's population is perhaps 4 million souls, while Philip rules over 40 million. English annual revenues amount to perhaps £300,000, while Spanish income from America alone exceeds 2 million ducats yearly. If Spain ever concentrates its full power against England, how can the island kingdom hope to survive? The answer, English strategists believe, must lie in sea power and in avoiding the kind of decisive land battle where Spanish numerical superiority would prove overwhelming. England's new navy, rebuilt and expanded under the direction of John Hawkins as Treasurer of the Marine, represents a revolutionary approach to naval warfare. Where Spanish ships are built as floating castles, designed to grapple with enemies and fight hand-to-hand battles with soldiers and pikemen, English ships are designed as gun platforms, intended to stand off at long range and batter opponents into submission with superior artillery. This strategic revolution is not merely technical but cultural. The Spanish approach to naval warfare reflects their military tradition on land, where disciplined infantry formations decide battles through shock and staying power. The English approach reflects their experience as maritime raiders and traders, where speed, surprise, and superior seamanship count for more than sheer numbers. As 1588 dawns, both kingdoms understand that the long period of undeclared warfare is drawing to a close. Philip's preparations in Lisbon harbor cannot be concealed. Spanish agents report that more than 100 ships are gathering there, along with thousands of soldiers and sailors and vast quantities of military supplies. Elizabeth's spies confirm that this is no ordinary fleet but an armada intended for the conquest of England itself. The world holds its breath, waiting to see whether the mightiest empire since Rome can crush the upstart island kingdom that dares to challenge Spanish supremacy on the seas. Few observers expect England to survive the coming storm, but then few observers truly understand the revolutionary changes that are transforming the nature of naval warfare and the balance of power on the world's oceans. The stage is set for one of history's most dramatic confrontations, not just between two kingdoms, but between two different visions of how the world should be ordered, two different approaches to the relationship between political power and religious faith, two different concepts of how wars should be fought and won on the highway of the seas. Section 2. The Spanish Perspective, Philip's Grand Design. In the dim candlelit chambers of the Escorial, where shadows dance across walls lined with religious paintings and maps of distant kingdoms, Philip II of Spain contemplates the greatest military enterprise of his reign. The king sits motionless at his desk, his pale fingers steepled before him, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames as he considers the audacious plan that his advisors have laid before him, the complete conquest of England and the restoration of Catholic rule to that heretical island. Philip is not a man given to hasty decisions or dramatic gestures. Everything about him speaks of careful calculation and methodical planning. His black doublet is severe in its simplicity, unmarked by the jewels and decorations that other monarchs favor. His study is a monk's cell compared to the opulent chambers of other royal palaces, furnished only with the essentials needed for the endless work of governing an empire that spans 4 continents. Even his meals are simple bread, fish, a cup of watered wine taken while reading dispatches from distant provinces. Yet beneath this austere exterior burns a passion that has shaped European politics for 3 decades. Philip sees himself not merely as a king but as the earthly champion of Catholic Christendom, chosen by God to defend the true faith against the spreading poison of Protestant heresy. Every morning he hears Mass in his private chapel. Every evening he spends hours in prayer. And every decision he makes is filtered through the absolute certainty that he acts as God's instrument on earth. The enterprise of England, as his planners call it, represents more than mere political conquest. In Philip's mind, it is nothing less than a holy crusade to restore England to the Catholic Church and bring Elizabeth Tudor to justice for her crimes against the faithful. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots has removed the last barrier to decisive action. For now there can be no negotiation, no compromise, no hope of peaceful resolution. Elizabeth has made herself God's enemy, and God's enemies must be destroyed. But Philip is also a practical ruler who understands that holy wars require earthly resources and careful planning. The conquest of England will demand the largest naval expedition in history, and every detail must be calculated with mathematical precision. Ships must be built or requisitioned, sailors recruited and trained, soldiers assembled and equipped, supplies gathered in quantities sufficient to sustain an army for months of campaigning. The logistics alone are staggering: food for 30,000 men, water for a voyage that may last weeks, cannon and powder and shot in quantities that will strain the resources of the royal arsenals. The king's advisors have been working on various versions of this plan for years, refining and revising their calculations as circumstances change. The Marquis of Santa Cruz, Spain's greatest admiral, originally proposed a direct assault with a fleet of more than 500 ships carrying 65,000 soldiers. The cost would have been astronomical, more than 4 million ducats, equivalent to 2 years of income from the American colonies. Even Philip's vast resources cannot support such expenditure, especially with the ongoing war in the Netherlands consuming hundreds of thousands of ducats annually. A more modest plan emerges from these financial constraints. The Duke of Parma, commanding Spanish forces in the Low Countries, suggests that a smaller fleet might transport his veteran army directly across the narrow waters of the English Channel. Parma's soldiers are the finest in Europe, hardened by 20 years of siege warfare in the Netherlands, experienced in the brutal business of storming fortified cities and crushing popular rebellions. If these troops can be landed on English soil, Parma argues, no English force can stand against them. The final plan that emerges from months of discussion represents a compromise between these approaches. A great armada will sail from Spain carrying enough soldiers to establish a beachhead on the English coast, while simultaneously collecting Parma's army from the Netherlands for the main invasion. The fleet will be large enough to fight its way through English opposition but not so massive as to bankrupt the royal treasury. 130 ships will carry approximately 30,000 men, soldiers, sailors, and support personnel sufficient to overwhelm English defenses once a secure landing has been achieved. Philip approves this strategy with characteristic deliberation, signing the authorization orders in his careful script and adding marginal notes that reveal his attention to minute details. He specifies the types of ships to be included, the quantities of supplies to be embarked, even the selection of priests who will accompany the expedition to provide spiritual guidance and administer the sacraments to Catholic England once the conquest is complete. The choice of commander proves more difficult than the strategic planning. The Marquis of Santa Cruz, Spain's most experienced admiral, dies suddenly in February 1588, leaving Philip without an obvious replacement. The king's first choice falls on the Duke of Medina Sidonia, Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, 7th Duke of one of Spain's greatest noble houses. On paper, Medina Sidonia seems an ideal selection. He is wealthy enough to finance much of the expedition from his own resources, politically reliable as a grandee of ancient lineage, and personally loyal to the crown through decades of faithful service. But Medina Sidonia himself recoils from the appointment with genuine horror. In a remarkable letter to the king, the Duke lists his qualifications for the command and finds them utterly inadequate. He has no experience of naval warfare, he admits, and knows nothing of the English coast or the peculiarities of channel navigation. He suffers from seasickness so severe that he can barely function aboard ship, and his finances are already strained by previous royal service. Most importantly, he lacks the personal authority to command the loyalty of Spain's most famous sea captains, men like Recalde and Oquendo who have spent their lives fighting England's pirates and privateers. Philip ignores these protests with typical stubbornness. In the king's mind, Medina Sidonia's noble birth outweighs all practical considerations. A grandee of Spain commands by right of blood, not by technical expertise, and the presence of experienced naval officers will compensate for any deficiencies in the Duke's seamanship. More importantly, Philip trusts Medina Sidonia's loyalty absolutely. The Duke will follow orders without question, will not be tempted to pursue personal glory at the expense of strategic objectives, and will maintain the religious discipline that Philip considers essential to the enterprise's success. The reluctant admiral accepts his appointment with the resignation of a man walking to his execution. He travels to Lisbon in March 1588 to take command of the greatest fleet ever assembled under Spanish colors. But his private correspondence reveals deep pessimism about the expedition's chances. The ships are in poor condition after months of preparation. He reports, many of the sailors are inexperienced landsmen pressed into service, and the supplies of food and water are already showing signs of spoilage despite careful preservation efforts. Worse yet, the strategic situation has deteriorated significantly since the original planning began. Drake's raid on Cadiz the previous year destroyed not only ships and supplies, but also seasoned timber that had been aging for months in preparation for the great expedition. The delay caused by this attack means that the Armada cannot sail until late spring, reducing the favorable weather window and allowing English preparations to reach completion. Intelligence reports from England describe a kingdom armed and ready for invasion. The English fleet has been expanded and modernized under John Hawkins's direction, with new ships designed specifically for long-range gunnery rather than traditional boarding tactics. Beacon chains have been established across the length and breadth of England, capable of transmitting news of invasion from the coast to London in a matter of hours. Militia units are drilling in every county, while professional soldiers returned from service in the Netherlands provide training and leadership for these amateur forces. Perhaps most ominously, English morale appears high rather than demoralized. Spanish agents report that Elizabeth's subjects seem eager for the coming fight, confident in their ability to repel invasion despite Spain's overwhelming advantages in numbers and resources. This popular enthusiasm troubles Spanish planners, who had hoped that England's Catholics would rise in support of the invasion, but instead find a kingdom apparently united in defiance of Spanish power. The religious dimension of the enterprise weighs heavily on Spanish planning. Pope Sixtus V has blessed the expedition and promised financial support, proclaiming it a holy crusade for the restoration of Catholic England. Spanish propaganda emphasizes the expedition's sacred character, portraying it as God's judgment upon a heretical queen who has persecuted the faithful and usurped the rights of the legitimate Catholic claimant to the English throne. This religious rhetoric serves important practical purposes. It justifies the enormous cost of the expedition to Spanish taxpayers already burdened by decades of warfare. It legitimizes Spanish claims to English allegiance by presenting Philip not as a foreign conqueror but as the rightful protector of English Catholics. Most importantly, It provides moral certainty to Spanish commanders and soldiers who might otherwise question the wisdom of attacking a fellow Christian kingdom. But the religious element also creates dangerous expectations. If this is truly God's enterprise, then divine providence should ensure its success regardless of human planning or material preparation. Spanish confidence in ultimate victory sometimes leads to a dangerous neglect of practical details, as if careful preparation might actually demonstrate lack of faith in God's protection. The ships gathering in Lisbon harbor throughout the spring of 1588 represent the greatest concentration of naval power ever assembled in European waters. The Portuguese carracks, massive vessels originally designed for the India trade, serve as the backbone of the fleet. These floating castles, some displacing more than 1,000 tons, tower above the water like medieval fortresses, their high castles bristling with cannon and crowded with soldiers ready for boarding actions. Spanish galleons provide the fleet's fighting strength, purpose-built warships designed for combat rather than commerce, armed with heavy guns and crewed by experienced naval officers who have learned their trade in battles against Turkish corsairs and English pirates. These ships embody Spanish naval philosophy, emphasizing size and firepower over speed and maneuverability, designed to close with enemies and fight decisive actions at short range where Spanish superior numbers and discipline will prove overwhelming. The fleet also includes dozens of smaller vessels, paddocks and zabras for scouting and communication, urcas and hulks for carrying supplies and equipment, galleasses that combine rowing power with sailing capability for operations in calm weather or restricted waters. Every type of vessel in the Spanish inventory has been pressed into service, creating a diverse armada that reflects the global reach of Philip's maritime empire. Manning these ships proves almost as challenging as building them. Spain's experienced sailors are scattered across the world's oceans, serving on treasure fleets from America, fighting Turkish galleys in the Mediterranean, or manning the vessels that maintain communication between Spain's far-flung possessions. The armada must make do with whatever crews can be assembled, supplementing veteran seamen with soldiers, landsmen, and foreign volunteers who bring enthusiasm but lack the specialized skills needed for complex naval operations. The Duke of Medina Sidonia works tirelessly to remedy these deficiencies, but his task is complicated by the sheer scale of the enterprise. Feeding 30,000 men requires careful calculation of supplies and storage space. Fresh water must be stored in sufficient quantities to last for weeks at sea, while remaining pure enough to drink despite the limitations of 16th-century preservation techniques. Gunpowder must be kept dry in wooden ships that leak constantly, while cannonballs and other ammunition must be distributed among the various vessels according to their armament and expected role in battle. Medical supplies present another challenge. The expedition's surgeons estimate casualties in the thousands based on previous military experience, requiring vast quantities of bandages, medicines, and surgical instruments. But space aboard ship is limited, and every cubic foot devoted to medical supplies means less room for food, water, or ammunition. The Duke must balance competing demands with inadequate information, making decisions that will determine whether his men live or die during the months of campaigning ahead. Religious preparation receives equal attention with material logistics. The fleet's chaplains conduct masses daily, leading prayers for divine protection and blessing the weapons that will be used against England's heretics. Special ceremonies consecrate the ships themselves, transforming them from mere vessels into instruments of God's will. The banners and standards that will fly from the mastheads are blessed by bishops, while the soldiers and sailors receive communion and make their confessions in preparation for holy war. Philip himself participates in these ceremonies when his duties permit, lending royal authority to the enterprise's sacred character. The king's presence at Mass, his public prayers for the expedition's success, his distribution of blessed medals and religious tokens to the commanders. All of these actions reinforce the message that Spain fights not for earthly conquest but for the glory of God and the salvation of souls. Yet beneath this confident exterior, troubling signs multiply as the sailing date approaches. Supply problems plague the fleet despite months of preparation. Food spoils in the warm weather. Water casks develop leaks. Gunpowder proves to be of inferior quality when tested. Desertion becomes a serious problem as pressed men slip away from their ships during the long weeks of preparation, forcing recruitment parties to scour the countryside for replacements. Most seriously, Reports from England suggest that the enemy is far better prepared than Spanish intelligence had indicated. English naval strength appears to have been significantly underestimated, while the hoped-for Catholic uprising shows no signs of materializing. Some Spanish commanders begin to question privately whether the enterprise has any realistic chance of success, but such doubts cannot be expressed publicly without appearing to question God's will and the king's judgment. The Duke of Medina Sidonia summarizes these concerns in his private correspondence, but his protests fall on deaf ears in the Escorial. Philip has committed himself irrevocably to the enterprise, has invested too much money and prestige to consider retreat. The Armada will sail as planned, trusting in divine providence to overcome whatever difficulties human weakness has failed to anticipate. As spring turns to summer and the favorable sailing season begins to pass, the pressure to depart becomes overwhelming. Every day of delay allows English preparations to grow stronger while Spanish resources grow weaker. The Duke's final inspections reveal persistent problems with ships, supplies, and personnel, but there is no more time for preparation. The enterprise of England must proceed on faith that God will provide what human planning has failed to achieve. The great fleet that finally departs Lisbon represents both the pinnacle of Spanish power and the beginning of its decline, though none who watch the forest of masts and sails disappearing beyond the horizon can imagine the disasters that await in the grey waters of the English Channel. Section 3. England prepares David versus Goliath. While Philip's great armada takes shape in the harbors of Spain and Portugal, across the narrow waters of the Bay of Biscay, England awakens to the reality of impending invasion with a mixture of defiance and desperate preparation. In the palaces of Westminster and Greenwich, in the dockyards of Chatham and Portsmouth, in the coastal towns and inland villages of a kingdom that has not faced foreign invasion for over 5 centuries, Elizabeth's subjects grapple with the terrifying prospect of Spanish conquest. The Queen herself maintains an outward composure that borders on the supernatural, but those closest to her can see the strain in her pale face and the tension in her slender hands as she reviews the endless stream of intelligence reports flowing in from her spy networks across Europe. At 54, Elizabeth has survived every challenge that 30 years of rule have thrown at her, but never has she faced a threat of such magnitude. The Spanish preparations cannot be concealed. Her agents report ships gathering in numbers that stagger the imagination, soldiers drilling in quantities that dwarf England's entire military establishment, supplies accumulating on a scale that suggests Philip means to stay until the conquest is complete. In the paneled chambers of the Privy Council, England's most experienced statesmen debate strategy with the urgency of men who know their lives and their faith hang in the balance. Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth's chief minister for 3 decades, spreads maps across the oak table and calculates distances, sailing times, and the logistical challenges that any invasion force must overcome. His aging eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, trace the possible routes a Spanish fleet might take, while his methodical mind catalogues England's defensive assets and finds them woefully inadequate. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, brings reports from his network of agents that paint an increasingly grim picture. Spanish intentions are unmistakable. This will be no mere raid or demonstration of force, but a full-scale invasion designed to overthrow Elizabeth's government and restore Catholic rule. The intelligence is so detailed that Walsingham can provide estimates of Spanish troop numbers, ship types, even the names of commanders assigned to various squadrons. Yet this very precision makes England's position seem more hopeless, for the numbers reveal a disparity in resources that would seem to guarantee Spanish victory. The Earl of Essex, young and hot-blooded, advocates for a preemptive strike against the Spanish preparations. Why wait passively for invasion, he argues, when English ships might strike the enemy in his own harbors before the great fleet can sail? The precedent exists. Drake's raid on Cadiz the previous year proved that Spanish ports are not impregnable, and surprise might accomplish what superior numbers cannot achieve through conventional warfare. Essex's enthusiasm reflects the confidence of youth and the aggressive spirit that has made English privateers the terror of Spanish commerce. But his elders understand the risks of such a strategy. The debate reveals fundamental disagreements about England's strategic situation and capabilities. The aggressive faction, led by Essex and supported by many of the sea captains, believes that England's best hope lies in offensive action, striking the enemy before he can concentrate his full strength, disrupting Spanish logistics, and forcing the war to be fought on Spanish terms rather than English ones. This strategy appeals to the English temperament and builds on the success of privateering expeditions, but it requires gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. The defensive faction, represented by older and more cautious counselors, argues for a strategy of patience and preparation. England cannot match Spanish resources ship for ship or man for man, but the kingdom possesses certain advantages that might be exploited if the war is fought on English terms. The narrow waters of the English Channel favor smaller, more maneuverable vessels over the great Spanish galleons. English familiarity with tides, currents, and hazards along their own coast provides tactical advantages that might offset Spanish numerical superiority. Most importantly, fighting a defensive war allows England to choose when and where to engage, avoiding decisive battle until circumstances favor the weaker party. Elizabeth herself navigates between these competing strategies with characteristic cunning. She authorizes Drake to prepare an expedition against Spanish ports, satisfying the aggressive faction while maintaining the option to cancel the mission if circumstances change. Simultaneously, she orders comprehensive defensive preparations throughout the kingdom, ensuring that England will be ready to resist invasion regardless of whether the preemptive strike succeeds or fails. This dual approach maximizes England's options while avoiding irreversible commitment to either purely offensive or purely defensive strategy. The defensive preparations reveal both England's strengths and its vulnerabilities with painful clarity. The kingdom's population is perhaps 4 million souls, compared to Spain's 8 million, but English society possesses certain characteristics that favor military resistance. The Protestant Reformation has created a people united by religious conviction and personal hatred of Catholic rule. The memory of Mary Tudor's burnings remains fresh in popular memory, while Spanish treatment of Protestant rebels in the Netherlands provides a grim preview of what English Protestants might expect under Catholic restoration. More practically, England's social structure provides advantages that Spanish planners may have underestimated. The kingdom's nobility, while small in numbers, are experienced military leaders who have learned their trade in the bitter wars of Ireland and the Netherlands. English yeomen and merchants form a middle class that is both prosperous enough to afford military equipment and educated enough to master the complexities of firearms and artillery. Even England's common laborers are more literate and better informed than their European counterparts, creating a population capable of understanding the stakes of the coming conflict and motivated to resist foreign conquest. The beacon system that spreads across England during the spring of 1588 exemplifies the kingdom's defensive preparations. From the southwestern tip of Cornwall to the Scottish border, from the Welsh mountains to the Norfolk coast, chains of signal fires are prepared on hilltops and church towers, each positioned to relay news of invasion across the length and breadth of the realm within hours of the first Spanish landing. The system requires careful coordination between local authorities, precise calculations of distances and sight lines, and detailed planning for fuel supplies and manning schedules. Yet the beacon chain also reveals England's social unity in the face of external threat. Lords and commoners work together to establish signal posts, contributing labor and materials according to their means. Parish churches provide storage for beacon fuel, while local militias organize watch schedules to ensure constant vigilance. The entire system depends on voluntary cooperation from thousands of individuals who understand that their personal survival depends on the kingdom's collective defense. Military preparations proceed with equal urgency but face more serious obstacles. England's regular military establishment is tiny compared to the forces Philip can deploy, perhaps 3,000 professional soldiers scattered among Irish garrisons and border fortresses, plus the gentlemen pensioners and yeomen of the guard who serve as the Queen's personal bodyguard. The kingdom's real military strength lies in its county militias, theoretically capable of fielding perhaps 60,000 men, but these forces vary enormously in equipment, training, and military effectiveness. The southern counties, most directly threatened by invasion, receive priority in military preparations. Militia units drill regularly under the supervision of experienced officers returned from service in the Netherlands and Ireland. Weapons are distributed from royal arsenals, while local authorities organize supplies of gunpowder, shot, and other military necessities. Fortifications are strengthened or constructed at likely landing sites, though England's long coastline makes comprehensive coastal defense impossible. The quality of these preparations depends largely on local leadership and resources. Counties with energetic lord lieutenants and prosperous populations create effective military forces, while poorer or more isolated regions struggle to field adequately equipped units. The disparity becomes apparent during musters and training exercises, where some companies appear in proper military formation with standardized weapons and equipment, while others resemble armed mobs with whatever weapons their members can afford or improvise. Naval preparations receive more systematic attention, building on the reforms that John Hawkins has implemented as Treasurer of the Marine. The English fleet that emerges from the dockyards of Chatham, Portsmouth, and private shipyards represents a revolution in naval architecture and tactics. Where Spanish ships are built as floating fortresses designed for grappling and boarding actions, English vessels are conceived as gun platforms optimized for long-range artillery combat. The technical differences reflect fundamentally different approaches to naval warfare. Spanish galleass and galleons carry large numbers of soldiers intended to overwhelm enemy crews in hand-to-hand combat. Their high castles provide elevated platforms for small arms fire and create psychological intimidation through sheer size and imposing appearance. Heavy construction allows these ships to absorb tremendous punishment while closing to point-blank range where superior numbers tell. English ships sacrifice passenger space and cargo capacity for speed and firepower. Their lower profiles reduce wind resistance and make them more difficult targets, while their fine lines allow superior sailing performance in the variable winds of northern waters. Most importantly, their gun decks are designed around the principle that naval battles should be won by artillery rather than infantry, with cannon positioned for maximum effectiveness at the ranges where English advantages in seamanship and gunnery can be exploited. The human element proves as important as ship design in preparing England's naval defense. The kingdom's sea captains represent a unique combination of practical experience and innovative thinking that Spanish commanders may find difficult to counter. Francis Drake, now in his late 40s, has spent his entire adult life fighting Spanish power on the world's oceans. His circumnavigation of the globe proved English capability for long-range navigation and seamanship, while his raids on Spanish commerce demonstrated tactical innovations that traditional naval thinking had not anticipated. Drake's fellow commanders bring equally impressive credentials to the coming conflict. John Hawkins, besides his role as naval administrator, pioneered English penetration of Spanish colonial markets and learned through bitter experience the strengths and weaknesses of Spanish naval forces. Martin Frobisher combines Arctic exploration with privateering experience, while Sir Walter Raleigh contributes both practical seamanship and strategic thinking about England's role in global affairs. These men understand Spanish capabilities from personal encounter rather than theoretical study, and their tactical innovations reflect lessons learned in actual combat. Yet English naval preparations also reveal serious weaknesses that Spanish intelligence has identified and hopes to exploit. The kingdom's financial resources are stretched to the breaking point by the cost of maintaining an expanded fleet, while simultaneously preparing land defenses and supporting military operations in the Netherlands and Ireland. Elizabeth's annual revenues amount to perhaps £400,000, while the cost of keeping a large fleet at sea for an extended period may consume half of that amount within months of active operations. Supply problems plague English preparations just as they complicate Spanish planning, though on a smaller scale. Feeding and watering ships' crews for months at sea requires careful logistics and substantial financial resources. Gunpowder and shot must be manufactured or imported in quantities that strain England's limited industrial capacity. Ship maintenance becomes critical when vessels must remain seaworthy through extended operations in the rough waters of the Channel and North Sea. Most seriously, English naval strategy depends on assumptions about Spanish behavior that may prove incorrect. English commanders plan to avoid decisive battle while harassing Spanish forces with long-range gunnery, gradually wearing down the enemy through superior seamanship and more effective use of artillery. This strategy requires Spanish cooperation. If the Armada refuses to be drawn into extended skirmishing and instead forces close-range battles where Spanish advantages in size and numbers can be decisive, English tactical superiority may prove irrelevant. The appointment of Lord Howard of Effingham as Lord Admiral reflects Elizabeth's attempt to balance competing considerations in choosing naval leadership. Howard lacks the practical seamanship experience of Drake or Hawkins, but his noble birth ensures that he can command the loyalty and obedience of England's proudest sea captains. His diplomatic skills may prove crucial in coordinating operations between different squadrons and personalities, while his political connections provide direct access to the Queen and Privy Council when rapid decisions are required. Howard's relationship with his subordinate commanders reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of English naval organization. Drake serves as vice admiral, bringing unmatched experience and tactical brilliance to the command structure, but his independent temperament and aggressive instincts sometimes conflict with broader strategic requirements. Hawkins provides essential expertise in naval administration and ship handling, while Frobisher contributes the blunt courage and determination that English crews will need when facing Spanish numerical superiority. The integration of these diverse personalities and approaches into a unified naval strategy represents one of England's greatest challenges in preparing for the coming conflict. Spanish command structure, for all its problems, follows clear hierarchical principles that ensure unified action even when individual commanders disagree with strategic decisions. English naval leadership, by contrast, depends on voluntary cooperation between proud and independent captains who are accustomed to making their own decisions and following their own tactical instincts. As spring turns to summer and intelligence reports confirm that Spanish sailing is imminent, English preparations reach fever pitch. Drake's proposed preemptive strike is authorized and then cancelled as changing circumstances make the risks appear too great. Militia units complete their training and take up positions along the southern coast, while naval squadrons concentrate at Plymouth and other strategic harbors. The beacon chains are tested and found ready, supplies are distributed to forward positions, and final prayers are offered in churches throughout the realm. The England that awaits Spanish invasion in the summer of 1588 is a kingdom transformed by the prospect of mortal danger. Social divisions that normally divide English society have temporarily dissolved in the face of external threat, while religious conviction provides motivation that transcends mere patriotism. The tactical innovations and strategic planning of the past few years will soon face their ultimate test, as English seamanship and courage confront the greatest naval force ever assembled in European waters. Few neutral observers expect the island kingdom to survive the coming storm, but then few observers truly understand the revolutionary changes that have transformed English society and naval capabilities during Elizabeth's remarkable reign. Section 4. The Armada sets sail. 130 ships leave Lisbon. The morning of May 30th, 1588, dawns gray and humid over the Tagus River, where the greatest fleet in history lies at anchor before the ancient city of Lisbon. From the fortress of Belém to the commercial wharves of the Ribeira, every available anchorage bristles with masts and yards, creating a forest of timber that stretches beyond the horizon. The air hangs heavy with the smell of tar and hemp, of gunpowder and provisioned meat, of 30,000 men preparing for the most ambitious military enterprise the world has ever witnessed. The Duke of Medina Sidonia stands on the stern gallery of his flagship, the San Martin, watching the final preparations with the weary resignation of a man who has accepted his fate. The great Carrack towers 7 stories above the water, her sides bristling with bronze cannon, her decks crowded with soldiers in half-armor, who lean against the railings and stare toward the mouth of the river where their destiny awaits. The Duke's own cabin, spacious by the standards of any other vessel, feels cramped and airless as he reviews the final dispatches from the Escorial, each one emphasizing the sacred nature of the enterprise and the king's complete confidence in divine protection. But Medina Sidonia knows what the king's dispatches do not acknowledge, that this great armada, for all its impressive appearance, sails with fundamental weaknesses that may prove fatal when tested against English guns and English seamanship. The months of preparation in Lisbon have revealed problems that all the king's gold and all the Pope's blessings cannot resolve. Ships that looked magnificent in the harbor prove cranky and unresponsive when handled at sea. Crews that appeared adequate in numbers reveal dangerous gaps in experience and training when called upon to perform the complex maneuvers that naval warfare demands. The morning ritual of departure begins before dawn with masses conducted on every ship in the fleet. Priests in white surplices move among the soldiers and sailors, dispensing communion and blessing the weapons that will be used against England's heretics. The great banner of the expedition, blessed by the Pope himself and embroidered with the arms of Spain and the sacred image of the crucifixion, is raised to the mainmast of the San Martin while cannon thunder across the harbor and bells ring from every church tower in Lisbon. The ceremony serves practical as well as spiritual purposes, providing final opportunity for the fleet's commanders to review their orders and confirm their understanding of the grand strategy. The plan, refined through months of discussion between the Escorial and Lisbon, calls for the Armada to sail northward along the coasts of Spain and France, fighting its way through any English opposition until it reaches the narrow waters off Calais. There it will rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army, embark those veteran soldiers, and transport them across the Channel for the invasion of England proper. The strategy appears logical on paper, but its execution will require precise coordination between forces separated by hundreds of miles and facing unpredictable opposition. Medina Sidonia must maintain his fleet's cohesion while fighting running battles against English squadrons that can choose when and where to engage. Parma must have his army ready at exactly the right moment, with transport barges prepared and supplies assembled for immediate embarkation. Any delay or miscommunication could prove fatal, yet the plan allows no margin for the inevitable accidents and delays that plague all military operations. The composition of the Great Armada reflects both Spain's global resources and the compromises forced by financial and logistical constraints. The backbone of the fleet consists of 20 Portuguese carracks, massive vessels originally designed for the India trade, but now converted to military service. These floating fortresses, some displacing more than 1,000 tons, carry the expedition's heaviest guns and largest contingents of soldiers. Their high castles and thick scantlings should enable them to absorb tremendous punishment while closing to point-blank range where Spanish superiority in hand-to-hand combat can be decisive. Spanish galleons provide the fleet's primary fighting strength, 42 purpose-built warships armed with the finest bronze cannon that royal foundries can produce. These vessels represent the pinnacle of Spanish naval architecture, combining impressive firepower with the seaworthiness needed for long ocean voyages. Their experienced crews have learned their trade fighting Turkish corsairs in the Mediterranean and English pirates in the Atlantic, while their officers include some of Spain's most celebrated naval commanders. The Armada's diversity extends far beyond these major warships. 34 smaller vessels, paddocks, zabras, and pinnaces serve as scouts and messengers, their speed and maneuverability essential for maintaining communication across the fleet's extended formation. 23 urcas and hulks carry the expedition's supplies and equipment, their deep holds packed with provisions intended to sustain the army through months of campaigning in hostile territory. For galleasses from the Neapolitan squadron combine rowing power with sailing capability, designed to operate effectively in the calm waters and contrary winds that often characterize channel warfare. Each category of vessel brings its own advantages and limitations to the fleet's capabilities. The great carracks, for all their impressive armament, prove sluggish and difficult to handle in the variable winds of northern waters. The galleons, though faster and more maneuverable, lack the passenger capacity needed to transport large numbers of soldiers. The supply ships, essential for the expedition's logistics, cannot defend themselves against determined attack and require constant protection from the fighting vessels. Manning this diverse fleet presents challenges that Spanish planning has only partially resolved. The expedition requires approximately 8,000 experienced seamen to handle the ships effectively, but Spain's maritime resources are stretched thin by global commitments. Experienced sailors are scattered across the world's oceans, serving on treasure fleets from America, manning the galleys that patrol the Mediterranean, or operating the merchant vessels that maintain trade between Spain's far-flung possessions. The crews actually assembled for the Armada represent a compromise between ideal requirements and practical possibilities. Perhaps half are experienced seamen who understand the complexities of handling large sailing vessels in difficult conditions. The remainder consists of soldiers temporarily assigned to maritime duties, landsmen pressed into service from Spanish and Portuguese ports, and foreign volunteers attracted by promises of pay and plunder. This mixed manning creates command problems that will become apparent once the fleet encounters the stresses of actual combat. The expedition's military component reflects similar compromises between strategic requirements and available resources. 19,000 soldiers embark with the fleet, drawn from the finest units in Spanish service. The tercios of Naples and Sicily bring veteran troops hardened by campaigns against Turkish invasions and Italian rebellions. Spanish regiments from the homeland contribute soldiers trained in the brutal warfare of the Netherlands, where Spanish arms have slowly reconquered the southern provinces through systematic siege warfare and ruthless suppression of civilian resistance. Portuguese units add local knowledge and experience in amphibious operations, having participated in the conquest of Morocco and the suppression of rebellions in the Atlantic islands. German and Italian mercenaries provide specialized skills in artillery and engineering, while companies of Spanish nobles serve as heavy cavalry intended to exploit any breakthrough once the army reaches English soil. Yet even this impressive military force reveals weaknesses that may prove critical when tested against English opposition. The soldiers are trained and equipped for European warfare, where disciplined infantry formations decide battles through shock action and superior firepower. They have little experience with the kind of naval combat they may face during the Channel crossing, where seamanship and gunnery matter more than traditional military virtues. Moreover, the Army's equipment and supplies have been calculated for land campaigns rather than extended operations at sea. Armor and weapons suitable for European battlefields may prove awkward and impractical aboard crowded ships. Food and water provisions, adequate for normal military operations, may spoil during the weeks or months that the fleet will spend at sea. Medical supplies and personnel, sufficient for anticipated battle casualties, may prove inadequate for the diseases and injuries that maritime expeditions typically suffer. The fleet's artillery represents one area where Spanish confidence appears justified by objective comparison. The expedition carries more than 2,000 cannon of various sizes and types, from massive 40-pounder siege guns intended for reducing English fortifications to light swivel guns designed for clearing enemy decks at close range. Spanish bronze foundries have achieved remarkable technical excellence in gun manufacture, producing weapons that combine impressive firepower with reliability and accuracy. The great Lombards embarked in the largest carracks can smash through the heaviest English ship construction, while the culverins and demiculverins mounted in the galleons provide effective firepower at the medium ranges where much of the fighting will occur. Spanish gunners, trained in the Mediterranean wars against the Turks, understand their weapons' capabilities and limitations, while the expedition's powder and shot have been manufactured to the highest standards that royal arsenals can achieve. Yet artillery excellence means little without the tactical doctrine and ship-handling skills needed to bring guns to bear effectively against maneuverable opponents. Spanish naval tradition emphasizes grappling and boarding rather than long-range gunnery, reflecting the influence of Mediterranean galley warfare where ramming and hand-to-hand combat determine victory. The transition to Atlantic sailing ship tactics requires different skills and different thinking, changes that Spanish commanders may not have fully internalized. The provisions embarked for the expedition reveal both impressive logistical planning and dangerous vulnerabilities that time will expose. 6 months' supplies of biscuit, salt pork, cheese, and wine fill the holds of transport vessels, calculated to sustain 30,000 men through the Channel crossing and the initial phases of the English campaign. Water casks contain liquid enough for normal consumption, while additional supplies can presumably be obtained from captured English ports once the invasion succeeds. But these calculations assume ideal conditions that military operations rarely provide. The food has been prepared using 16th-century preservation techniques that work adequately in cool, dry climates but may fail in the damp conditions of northern seas. Water casks, hewn from green timber and sealed with pitch, will develop leaks that contaminate their contents with the bilge water that collects in every ship's hull. Vermin and spoilage will reduce the effective quantity of provisions, while combat stress and seasickness will increase the men's nutritional requirements beyond normal planning assumptions. The fleet's organization reflects Spanish administrative excellence and reveals potential command problems that English tactics may exploit. Medina Sidonia exercises overall command from the San Martin, but the Armada's size requires delegation of authority to squadron commanders who must make tactical decisions without constant reference to the flagship. The Portuguese squadron, led by the Duke of Aveiro, includes the fleet's largest and most powerful vessels but operates under commanders whose loyalties to the Spanish crown remain uncertain. Juan Martínez de Recalde commands the Biscayan squadron with the authority of Spain's most experienced admiral, but his advanced age and poor health may limit his effectiveness during extended operations. Don Pedro de Valdez leads the Andalusian ships with aggressive competence, while Diego Flores de Valdez brings administrative skill and political connections to the command of the Castilian squadron. Each of these men possesses impressive credentials and proven ability, but their cooperation in battle will depend on communication systems and command procedures that have never been tested under combat conditions. The final preparations reveal both Spanish thoroughness and the accumulated problems that months of delay have created. The fleet's departure has been postponed repeatedly, first by Drake's raid on Cadiz, then by storms that scattered ships intended for the expedition, finally by the death of the Marquis of Santa Cruz and the need to reorganize command arrangements. Each delay has allowed English preparations to advance while Spanish readiness has deteriorated through the corrosive effects of extended mobilization. Ships that were in excellent condition during the winter now show signs of wear and damage from months of harbor duty. Rigging has stretched and weakened from constant handling, while hulls have developed leaks from the working of green timber in harbor swells. Food supplies, carefully calculated for immediate consumption, have begun to spoil in the warm weather of late spring. Most seriously, the fleet's morale has suffered from extended preparation without action, as soldiers and sailors grow restive with enforced idleness and begin to question the wisdom of the entire enterprise. Medina Sidonia's private correspondence during these final days reveals a man torn between duty and despair. His letters to the king catalog persistent problems with ships, supplies, and personnel, while emphasizing the risks inherent in sailing so late in the season. He requests permission to postpone the expedition until the following year, when better preparation might remedy the deficiencies that have become apparent during the Lisbon mobilization. Philip's responses reveal characteristic stubbornness and religious certainty. The king acknowledges the difficulties his admiral reports, but emphasizes that God's will must be done regardless of human calculations. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots has made delay impossible. Catholic Europe expects Spanish action, and Philip's credibility as the champion of Catholic Christendom depends on immediate response to Elizabeth's provocations. The Armada will sail as planned, trusting in divine providence to overcome whatever obstacles human weakness has failed to anticipate. The departure ceremony itself reflects this tension between magnificent display and underlying uncertainty. As the great fleet weighs anchor and begins its ponderous movement toward the river mouth, cannon thunder from the fortress of Belém while crowds line the waterfront to cheer their departing heroes. Banners stream from every masthead, creating a pageant of color and movement that would inspire confidence in any observer who could not see the confusion and inefficiency that plague the fleet's actual handling. Ships collide in the crowded anchorage as inexperienced crews struggle with complex sailing maneuvers. Signal guns fire constantly as squadron commanders attempt to coordinate movement through a forest of masts and sails. The wind, light and variable from the southeast, forces the fleet to work slowly down the river while maintaining formation proves almost impossible in the confined waters. The armada that finally clears the Tagus and sets course northward along the Portuguese coast represents both the pinnacle of Spanish power and the beginning of its decline. Though few who watch the forest of sails disappearing into the morning haze can imagine the disasters that await in the gray waters of the English Channel. 130 ships carrying 30,000 men sail toward a destiny that will reshape the balance of power in Europe and determine whether Catholic or Protestant Christianity will dominate the emerging global order. The great enterprise has begun, and there can be no turning back. Section 5. First Contact, the running battle begins. The morning of July 19, 1588, breaks gray and misty over the waters off Cornwall, where Captain Thomas Fleming of the bark Golden Hind strains his eyes through the summer haze that blankets the western approaches to the English Channel. Fleming has been patrolling these waters for weeks, one of dozens of English scouts watching for the first sign of Spanish sails, and the tedium of constant vigilance has begun to weigh on his crew's morale. The prevailing westerly winds have kept his small vessel beating back and forth across the same stretch of ocean, while rumors and false alarms have raised and dashed expectations so many times that even the most optimistic sailors have begun to wonder if the great Spanish Armada is more myth than reality. Then, through the lifting mist, Fleming sees what every English mariner has been dreading and expecting: a forest of masts and sails stretching from horizon to horizon, moving steadily eastward with the ponderous inevitability of fate itself. The Spanish Armada, for months a distant threat discussed in council chambers and taverns, has suddenly become a terrifying reality bearing down on England's shores with all the weight of Philip's imperial power behind it. Fleming's first instinct is disbelief, for the sheer scale of what he sees exceeds even the most alarming intelligence reports. The Spanish fleet extends across miles of ocean, its formation so vast that he cannot count the individual ships or estimate their true numbers. The great carracks and galleons tower above the water like floating castles, their high sides bristling with cannon, their decks crowded with soldiers whose armor glints dully in the overcast light. Smaller vessels scout ahead and guard the flanks, while supply ships lumber in the center, their deep-laden hulls testament to Spanish logistical preparation. The Golden Hind turns and runs before the wind toward Plymouth, her crew working with desperate efficiency to extract every knot of speed from their small vessel. Fleming knows that hours or even minutes may determine whether England receives adequate warning of the invasion, and his bark's shallow draft and intimate knowledge of inshore waters give him crucial advantages over any Spanish pursuit. Behind him, the Great Armada continues its stately progress toward the English coast, still unaware that their approach has been detected and reported. At Plymouth, the English fleet lies at anchor in the protected waters of the Sound, where Lord Howard of Effingham has concentrated the kingdom's naval strength for the confrontation that everyone knows must come. The scene presents a stark contrast to Spanish magnificence, perhaps 60 English ships of various sizes, none approaching the massive scale of the great Spanish carracks, but all built and armed according to the revolutionary principles that John Hawkins has developed during his years as treasurer of the Marine. The English vessels lie low in the water, their sleek lines designed for speed and maneuverability rather than imposing display. Their gun decks, crammed with culverins and demiculverins, reflect a tactical philosophy that emphasizes long-range artillery combat over the boarding actions that Spanish tradition favors. Most importantly, their crews represent the finest seamen that England can provide, volunteers rather than pressed men, professionals who have learned their trade in the hard school of privateering expeditions against Spanish commerce. Francis Drake, Vice Admiral of the fleet and the most famous of Elizabeth's sea captains, receives Fleming's news while playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe with his fellow commanders. The legend that will later grow around this moment, Drake's calm insistence on finishing his game before dealing with the Spanish threat, captures something essential about English confidence and Spanish underestimation of their opponents. Whether the story is literally true matters less than the spirit it represents. For Drake and his colleagues have spent their careers fighting Spanish power and know that panic serves no purpose when skill and preparation must carry the day. The reality of the situation allows little time for dramatic gestures, however legendary they may become in later telling. The English fleet must work out of Plymouth Harbor against the prevailing westerly wind, a complex maneuver that requires several hours of careful seamanship even under ideal conditions. With the Spanish Armada approaching and the tide schedule working against them, Howard's captains face their first tactical challenge before they can even reach open water to begin the real fighting. The evening of July 19th finds both fleets maneuvering for advantage in the waters south of the Cornish Peninsula, as the great confrontation that has been building for months finally begins to take shape. The Spanish formation, observed from English ships as the distance closes, reveals both impressive discipline and tactical inflexibility that English commanders hope to exploit. The Armada advances in a great crescent formation, with the most powerful fighting ships on the flanks and the vulnerable supply vessels protected in the center. Medina Sidonia's tactical deployment reflects orthodox Spanish naval doctrine, designed to prevent English ships from attacking the fleet's weakest elements while bringing maximum firepower to bear against any force that attempts to break the formation. The great carracks and galleons of the fighting squadrons bristle with heavy cannon, their high sides providing elevated platforms for small arms fire and their thick scantlings capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. Spanish soldiers crowd the decks and rigging, ready to overwhelm any English vessel that comes within boarding range. But the formation that looks so impressive to observers reveals dangerous weaknesses that English tactical innovation may be able to exploit. The Armada's size makes rapid maneuvers almost impossible, while the need to protect slow supply ships reduces the fighting vessel's freedom of action. Most critically, the Spanish formation assumes that battle will be fought at close range where superior numbers and heavier armament can prove decisive, but English ships may be able to avoid such encounters while inflicting damage through long-range gunnery. The first skirmishes begin as evening approaches and the two fleets draw within cannon range of each other. English ships, working to windward with superior sailing ability, open fire at distances that Spanish tradition considers excessive for effective combat. The English culverins, lighter than Spanish guns but more accurate and faster firing, begin to find their targets among the great ships of the Armada's flanks, while Spanish return fire falls short or passes harmlessly overhead. The tactical revelation proves shocking to Spanish expectations and encouraging to English hopes. Spanish gunnery, designed for close-range combat where heavy shot can smash through the stoutest construction, proves less effective at the medium ranges where English advantages in ship handling force most engagements to occur. English guns, though individually less powerful than Spanish weapons, can be loaded and fired more rapidly, creating a higher volume of shot that begins to tell against Spanish rigging and superstructure. More importantly, the opening exchanges reveal fundamental differences in tactical philosophy that will shape the entire campaign. Spanish commanders expect to close with their enemies and fight decisive actions where superior numbers and heavier armament can overwhelm opposition. English captains prefer to maintain distance while using superior seamanship to choose when and where to engage, gradually wearing down opponents through cumulative damage rather than seeking immediate decisive results. The first day's fighting produces no dramatic victories for either side, but the pattern it establishes will characterize the entire Channel campaign. English ships dart in to attack isolated Spanish vessels, pour in several broadsides at medium range, then withdraw before Spanish return fire can become effective or boarding parties can be organized. Spanish formations hold together with admirable discipline, but their inability to force close combat allows English harassment to continue indefinitely. Drake leads one of the most successful English attacks, taking his flagship revenge against the great Spanish galleon San Lorenzo and demonstrating the tactical advantages that English innovations provide. The Revenge's low profile and fine lines allow her to sail closer to the wind than her Spanish opponent, while her guns can be trained and fired more rapidly than the galleon's heavier weapons. Drake pours several broadsides into the San Lorenzo's high sides, causing visible damage to rigging and superstructure, then withdraws before Spanish reinforcements can intervene. The psychological impact of these early encounters may prove more significant than the material damage they inflict. Spanish commanders, confident in their superior numbers and traditional tactical methods, discover that their opponents possess advantages they had not anticipated. English seamanship allows the smaller fleet to concentrate force against isolated Spanish vessels while avoiding the kind of general engagement where Spanish numerical superiority could prove overwhelming. English morale, initially depressed by the sheer scale of Spanish preparation, begins to rise as the day's fighting demonstrates that the Great Armada is not invincible. Spanish ships, for all their impressive appearance, prove vulnerable to English gunnery when engaged at the ranges that English tactical doctrine favors. Spanish formations, though disciplined and well-organized, cannot prevent English harassment or force the kind of decisive battle that Spanish strategy requires. The night of July 19th finds both fleets anchored in sight of each other, their commanders assessing the day's lessons and planning strategy for the battles to come. English councils of war aboard Howard's flagship, the Ark Royal, reveal cautious optimism tempered by realistic assessment of the challenges ahead. The day's fighting has proven that English tactics can inflict damage on Spanish ships without suffering proportional losses in return, but the Armada's size and cohesion remain formidable obstacles to decisive English victory. Drake advocates for aggressive night attacks designed to disrupt Spanish formations and prevent organized resistance, but more cautious voices counsel patience and systematic harassment rather than risky operations that might play to Spanish advantages in close combat. The debate reflects fundamental questions about English strategic objectives. Should the fleet seek to destroy the Armada outright, or will it be sufficient to prevent Spanish forces from linking up with Parma's army in the Netherlands? Spanish planning reveals growing awareness that English capabilities have been seriously underestimated in the months of preparation leading up to the campaign. Medina Sidonia's private dispatches to the king catalog problems that were not anticipated by Spanish intelligence. English gunnery proves more accurate than expected. English seamanship allows tactical maneuvers that Spanish formations cannot counter, and English morale appears high rather than demoralized by the prospect of confronting Spanish power. More troubling still, the first day's fighting reveals that Spanish tactical doctrine may be fundamentally unsuited to the kind of campaign that circumstances are forcing upon the Armada. Spanish success depends on bringing English ships to close combat where superior numbers and traditional boarding tactics can prove decisive, but English commanders show no inclination to accommodate Spanish preferences. If the English fleet can maintain its tactical discipline while avoiding decisive engagement, the Armada may find itself fighting a campaign for which it is poorly prepared. The supply situation aboard Spanish ships already shows signs of strain after just one day of active operations. The provisions embarked in Lisbon, calculated for normal consumption during a brief channel crossing, must now sustain 30,000 men through extended maneuvering and combat operations whose duration cannot be predicted. Water consumption increases dramatically when men are working hard under stress, while combat damage to casks and storage facilities reduces the effective quantity of supplies available. Medical problems, always serious aboard crowded ships, multiply rapidly once active operations begin. Seasickness affects thousands of soldiers who have never experienced extended sea duty, reducing their effectiveness and increasing their nutritional requirements. Combat casualties, though relatively light during the first day's fighting, strain medical facilities that were designed for land campaigns rather than naval operations. Most seriously, the Armada's tight formations and defensive tactics prevent foraging or resupply from English sources, forcing complete dependence on provisions embarked in Spain. English ships, operating from familiar bases and supported by friendly populations ashore, can replenish supplies as needed, while Spanish forces must make their original provisions last for the entire campaign regardless of its eventual duration. The dawn of July 20th reveals both fleets preparing for renewed combat, but the tactical situation has subtly shifted in England's favor overnight. Spanish formations, though still intact and impressive, show signs of the wear and confusion that extended operations inevitably produce. English squadrons, reinforced by additional vessels from Portsmouth and the Thames, demonstrate growing confidence and coordination as their tactical innovations prove effective against Spanish traditional methods. The battle that is about to resume will test both sides' ability to adapt to circumstances that neither fully anticipated during months of preparation. Spanish commanders must find ways to force close combat despite English advantages in speed and maneuverability, while English captains must maintain their tactical discipline despite the psychological pressure of confronting the largest fleet ever assembled in European waters. The running battle up the English Channel has begun, and with it the decisive test of whether traditional Spanish naval supremacy can overcome the tactical revolution that English innovation has created. The stakes could not be higher. The independence of England, the future of Protestant Christianity in Europe, and the emerging balance of power between the old imperial order and the new maritime challenges that threaten to reshape the world. Section 6. The Channel Gauntlet Running Battle Up the English Channel. For 7 days and nights, the greatest naval chase in history unfolds across the narrow waters of the English Channel, as the Spanish Armada fights its way eastward toward its rendezvous with destiny, while English squadrons hang on its flanks like wolves shadowing a wounded elk. The running battle that develops between Plymouth and Calais will test every assumption about naval warfare, every calculation about strategy and tactics, every belief about the relationship between divine providence and human skill that both sides have brought to this ultimate confrontation. The morning of July 21st finds the two fleets approximately 20 miles south of Portland Bill, where the peculiar tides and currents of the channel create navigational hazards that favor local knowledge over superior numbers. Here, off the rocky headland that guards the approaches to Weymouth Bay, the English fleet demonstrates for the first time the tactical flexibility that will characterize their entire campaign. Howard divides his forces into 4 squadrons, each commanded by a captain whose reputation has been earned in years of combat against Spanish power on the world's oceans. Drake takes his squadron wide to seaward, positioning himself to attack the Armada's seaward flank where the great fighting galleons of the Portuguese and Biscayan squadrons present the most formidable targets. His flagship Revenge, veteran of countless privateering expeditions, leads a line of English race-built galleons that embody the revolutionary principles John Hawkins has developed during his tenure as Treasurer of the Marine. These ships, lower and sleeker than their Spanish counterparts, can sail closer to the wind and maneuver more rapidly in the confined waters of the Channel. Howard himself, aboard the Ark Royal, positions his squadron to threaten the Armada's landward flank, where the Spanish formation must navigate between the English fleet and the dangerous waters off Portland. The Lord Admiral's tactical instincts, honed by months of study and consultation with his more experienced subordinates, reveal an understanding of how English advantages in seamanship can be exploited against Spanish numerical superiority. Hawkins and Frobisher command the remaining squadrons, their ships forming a loose screen that can concentrate rapidly against targets of opportunity while maintaining the mobility needed to avoid decisive engagement. The English formation sacrifices the visual impact of Spanish mass for tactical flexibility, allowing individual captains to exercise initiative while maintaining overall coordination through signal systems that reflect years of experience in cooperative ventures against Spanish commerce. The Spanish response reveals both the strengths and limitations of their traditional approach to naval warfare. Medina Sidonia maintains his Great Crescent formation, but the defensive posture that served him well in the open waters off Cornwall proves less effective in the restricted environment of the Channel. The Armada's need to maintain course toward Calais prevents the tactical freedom that might allow Spanish commanders to force the kind of close engagement where their advantages in size and firepower could prove decisive. The Battle of Portland Bill begins in earnest as the morning mist lifts and both fleets find themselves within cannon range in waters that will test seamanship as severely as gunnery. The English attack develops with the coordination of a pack hunt, as individual squadrons probe different parts of the Spanish formation while maintaining communication through flag signals and prearranged tactical procedures. Drake opens the action by leading his squadron against the seaward wing of the Armada, where the great carrack San Martin de Portugal presents an irresistible target. The Portuguese flagship, displacing nearly 1,500 tons and carrying more than 50 guns, towers above the English ships like a floating mountain, her high castles crowded with soldiers and her sides bristling with heavy artillery. But her very size, so impressive in harbor or in formal battle line, becomes a liability in the tactical environment that English innovation has created. The Revenge approaches from windward, using her superior sailing qualities to choose the range and angle of engagement. Drake's gunners, veterans of dozens of actions against Spanish vessels, have learned to aim for rigging and superstructure rather than attempting to penetrate the massive scantlings of Spanish construction. Their culverins, lighter than Spanish guns but more accurate and faster firing, begin to tear gaps in the carrack's elaborate rigging while shot after shot crashes into her towering stern castle. The San Martin de Portugal responds with a thunderous broadside that sends 40-pound shots screaming across the water, but the range is too great and the target too small for Spanish heavy artillery to prove effective. The great guns, designed for battering fortifications or smashing through ship timbers at point-blank range, lack the accuracy needed for the medium-range gunnery that English tactics demand. More importantly, the time required to reload these massive weapons allows English ships to fire 2 or 3 broadsides while Spanish gunners are still preparing their next discharge. Howard's attack on the landward flank demonstrates different but equally effective tactical principles. The Ark Royal leads a line of English ships against the Andalusian squadron, where Don Pedro de Valdez commands from his flagship Nuestra Señora del Rosario. The Spanish ships, caught between the English attack and the hazardous waters off Portland, cannot maneuver freely without risking collision with their own formation or grounding on the rocky shore. The English attack exploits this tactical dilemma with ruthless efficiency. Howard's ships approach in line ahead, each vessel firing a full broadside into the Spanish formation before turning away to reload while the next ship in line takes up the attack. The tactic, borrowed from galley warfare but adapted to sailing ship conditions, allows the English to maintain continuous fire while presenting only brief targets for Spanish return fire. The Nuestra Señora del Rosario suffers the consequences of Spanish tactical inflexibility when a collision with another Spanish ship damages her bowsprit and reduces her maneuverability. Valdez, one of Spain's most experienced naval commanders, finds his flagship unable to keep station with the main formation as English ships close in for the kill. The situation deteriorates rapidly as successive English attacks further damage the Spanish flagship's rigging, until she falls helplessly astern of the Armada's protective formation. Drake, observing the Rosario's predicament from his position windward of the main battle, makes one of the tactical decisions that will establish his reputation as the most audacious of Elizabeth's sea captains. Rather than continuing his attack on the main Spanish formation, he breaks off to pursue the damaged flagship, recognizing that the capture of so important a vessel will provide both material and psychological advantages that outweigh the temporary reduction in English firepower against the Armada proper. The pursuit and capture of the Nuestra Señora del Rosario provides the first clear English victory of the campaign and demonstrates how tactical innovation can overcome numerical disadvantage. The Spanish flagship, for all her heavy armament and veteran crew, cannot defend herself effectively once separated from the mutual support that Spanish tactical doctrine requires. Drake's approach, using superior seamanship to avoid Spanish strengths, while exploiting the isolation that English tactics have created, forces Valdez to surrender after token resistance. The psychological impact of this victory resonates throughout both fleets. English morale, buoyed by concrete evidence that Spanish ships can be defeated and captured, rises to levels that more than compensate for the numerical inferiority that had initially seemed so daunting. Spanish confidence, shaken by the loss of one of their most famous commanders and an irreplaceable warship, begins to show cracks that English pressure will systematically exploit. More importantly, the capture provides English intelligence with detailed information about Spanish capabilities, intentions, and internal problems. Valdez, interrogated by English officers who speak fluent Spanish from years of privateering expeditions, reveals that Spanish supplies are already showing signs of spoilage, that morale aboard many ships is poor due to inexperienced crews and overcrowded conditions, and that coordination between the various national squadrons is proving more difficult than Spanish planning had anticipated. The Armada's response to the loss of the Rosario reveals both Spanish discipline and the tactical constraints that English harassment is systematically exploiting. Medina Sidonia maintains his eastward course rather than turning back to rescue Valdez, recognizing that any delay increases the risks to his primary mission. The decision reflects sound strategic thinking, but its abandonment of a famous commander and veteran crew provides English propaganda with powerful evidence that Spanish solidarity is less solid than their impressive formations suggest. The running battle continues through July 22nd and 23rd, as both fleets work their way eastward through waters that grow increasingly familiar to English navigators and correspondingly hazardous for Spanish ships dependent on charts and local knowledge. Off the Isle of Wight, where Henry VIII Great Fortress of Sandown guards the approaches to Portsmouth, the English fleet demonstrates its growing tactical confidence by attempting a coordinated attack on the Armada's entire formation. The assault begins before dawn, as English ships use the darkness to achieve tactical surprise and favorable positioning. Howard leads the main attack against the Spanish center, where the great supply ships present tempting targets, while Drake and Hawkins coordinate flank attacks designed to prevent Spanish reinforcement of threatened sectors. The plan requires precise timing and exceptional seamanship, but English crews have gained confidence from their earlier successes and trust in their commander's tactical judgment. The battle off the Isle of Wight produces the fiercest fighting of the entire campaign, as Spanish commanders finally find opportunities to demonstrate the fighting qualities that have made their nation's navy feared throughout the world. The galleass San Lorenzo, commanded by Don Hugo de Moncada, uses her combination of sails and oars to position herself advantageously for close combat, while her heavy guns and veteran crew inflict serious damage on several English attackers. Frobisher's flagship Triumph suffers particularly heavy damage when Spanish shot brings down her foremast and kills several members of her crew. The English ship finds herself momentarily isolated and vulnerable to Spanish boarding tactics, but Drake's timely intervention with the Revenge prevents Spanish exploitation of their tactical opportunity. The incident demonstrates that English advantages in seamanship and gunnery do not guarantee immunity from Spanish retaliation when circumstances favor traditional naval combat. The day's fighting also reveals English limitations that Spanish observers are quick to note and report to their commanders. English ammunition consumption proves much higher than Spanish, as the rapid-fire tactics that give English gunnery its effectiveness require correspondingly large quantities of powder and shot. Howard's supply situation, adequate for brief engagements, begins to show strain as the running battle extends beyond originally anticipated duration. More seriously, English tactical coordination, impressive when attacking isolated targets, becomes more difficult to maintain during complex operations involving multiple squadrons and changing tactical situations. Several English ships find themselves engaged simultaneously by multiple Spanish opponents when signal confusion disrupts planned maneuvers. The incidents remind English commanders that their tactical innovations, however effective, require constant refinement and perfect execution to overcome Spanish advantages in numbers and individual ship firepower. Spanish resilience during these encounters provides Medina Sidonia with evidence that his fleet retains the capability for effective resistance despite English tactical advantages. Spanish gunnery, though less rapid than English fire, proves devastatingly effective when Spanish ships can force close engagements. Spanish seamanship, derided by English observers as inferior to their own, demonstrates impressive competence when Spanish crews operate within tactical frameworks that play to their training and experience. Most encouragingly from the Spanish perspective, the Armada's formation discipline holds firm despite repeated English attacks and the accumulated stress of continuous operations. Spanish supply ships remain under the protection of the fighting squadrons, while communication between different parts of the formation continues to function despite English efforts to disrupt Spanish coordination. The Great Crescent Formation, for all its tactical limitations, provides psychological as well as practical benefits that help maintain Spanish morale under extremely difficult circumstances. The night of July 23 finds both fleets anchored in sight of each other off the French coast, where the lights of Calais can be seen twinkling in the distance. The Spanish Armada has successfully fought its way through the entire length of the English Channel, maintaining its formation integrity and achieving its primary objective of reaching the rendezvous point where Parma's army awaits transportation to English shores. The strategic situation appears to favor Spanish plans, despite the tactical advantages that English innovation has demonstrated throughout the running battle. Yet the week of continuous fighting has subtly altered the balance of forces in ways that neither side fully appreciates. Spanish losses, though not catastrophic in absolute terms, have eliminated some of their most experienced commanders and finest ships. English confidence has grown with each tactical success, while Spanish morale has eroded under the constant pressure of harassment and the accumulated effects of supply problems and overcrowding. More fundamentally, the running battle has demonstrated that English tactical innovations can neutralize Spanish numerical superiority under the right circumstances. The lesson will prove crucial in the decisive encounters to come, as both fleets prepare for the climactic phase of a campaign that will determine the future balance of power in European waters. Spanish scouts report English reinforcements joining Howard's fleet during the night, as fresh squadrons from the Thames and Portsmouth add their strength to forces that have already proven capable of challenging Spanish supremacy. English intelligence confirms that Parma's army faces serious difficulties in preparing for immediate embarkation, while the pilots needed for navigating invasion barges across the channel remain unavailable. The stage is set for the final act of a drama that has already exceeded all expectations for its duration and intensity. Neither fleet can sustain indefinitely the kind of operations that have characterized the Channel fighting, but neither commander dares break off the engagement while strategic objectives remain unachieved. The resolution must come soon, and when it comes, it will reshape not only English and Spanish power but the entire future of European maritime supremacy. Section 7. Calais Roads, the Moment of Truth. The evening of July 27, 1588, finds the Spanish Armada at anchor in the roadstead off Calais, where the great fleet that has fought its way through the entire length of the English Channel finally reaches its appointed rendezvous with destiny. From the ramparts of the ancient fortress that guards the harbor entrance, French soldiers and civilians gaze in wonder at the forest of masts and yards that stretches across the anchorage, while Spanish lookouts scan the horizon for the first sign of the Duke of Parma's transport barges that should already be approaching from the Netherlands with the veteran army that will complete Philip's grand design for the conquest of England. The Duke of Medina Sidonia stands on the stern gallery of his flagship San Martin, watching the last of his ships take up their assigned positions in the defensive formation that Spanish naval doctrine prescribes for fleets at anchor in hostile waters. The great carracks and galleons arrange themselves in a protective crescent that shields the vulnerable supply ships from attack, while smaller vessels patrol the flanks and maintain communication with the shore. The formation looks impressive in the gathering dusk, but the Spanish commander knows that appearances deceive, for his fleet has reached this crucial point in a condition far different from what the original planning had anticipated. 7 days of continuous fighting have left their mark on ships and men alike. Spanish casualties, though not catastrophic in absolute numbers, have eliminated some of the fleet's most experienced officers and skilled seamen. The Nuestra Señora del Rosario, one of the finest ships in the Andalusian squadron, lies captured in English hands along with her veteran crew and irreplaceable commander. The great Gallia San Lorenzo bears visible scars from repeated English attacks, her elaborate superstructure shattered by English shot and her rowing capacity reduced by damage to oars and rigging. More seriously, the week of maneuvering and combat has revealed fundamental problems with Spanish supply planning that threaten to undermine the entire enterprise. Food spoilage, a constant concern during extended sea voyages, has accelerated in the warm summer weather and the stress of continuous operations. Water consumption has exceeded all calculations as men working hard under combat conditions require far more liquid than peacetime planning had allowed. Gunpowder reserves, though still adequate, have been depleted by the constant skirmishing that English harassment tactics have forced upon the fleet. Medical problems multiply daily as the overcrowded conditions aboard Spanish ships create ideal circumstances for the spread of disease. Dysentery, typhus, and scurvy begin to appear among crews already weakened by poor food and contaminated water. The fleet surgeons, trained for land campaigns where wounded men can be evacuated to proper hospitals, find themselves overwhelmed by the combination of combat casualties and epidemic disease that shipboard conditions produce. Yet the Spanish fleet's arrival at Calais represents a strategic achievement that seemed impossible when English attacks first began off Plymouth. Despite English tactical advantages in seamanship and gunnery, despite the constant harassment that has made every mile of the Channel crossing a battle, the Great Armada has maintained its formation integrity and reached its objective with the bulk of its fighting strength intact. From Medina Sidonia's perspective, the most difficult part of the campaign is now complete, and Spanish victory depends only on successful coordination with Parma's forces for the final assault on England. The reality of the strategic situation proves far more complex than Spanish planning had anticipated. Parma's army, theoretically ready for immediate embarkation, faces logistical nightmares that Spanish intelligence has failed to appreciate fully. The invasion barges, hastily constructed in the shallow waters of the Flemish coast, remain vulnerable to attack by Dutch rebels who control the sea approaches to most Netherlands ports. The pilots needed for navigating these unwieldy craft across the treacherous waters of the Channel simply do not exist in adequate numbers, while the complex tidal calculations required for landing operations exceed the capabilities of available navigation specialists. Most critically, the coordination between sea and land forces that the entire enterprise requires has broken down under the pressure of practical difficulties that theoretical planning had not foreseen. Communication between Medina Sidonia and Parma, dependent on small boats and mounted messengers operating across waters controlled by Dutch rebels, proves sporadic and unreliable. Each commander operates with incomplete information about the other's situation and capabilities, while the rigid schedule that Spanish strategy requires allows no margin for the delays and complications that invariably plague military operations. English naval commanders, observing Spanish movements from their own anchorage just beyond cannon range, recognize that the Armada's arrival at Calais presents both maximum danger and maximum opportunity for decisive action. Lord Howard calls a council of war aboard the Ark Royal, where England's most experienced sea captains gather to assess a situation that will determine their kingdom's survival. The men who crowd into the flagship's great cabin represent the finest naval talent that England possesses, veterans of countless actions against Spanish power, who understand better than any theoretical strategists how Spanish strengths might be overcome and Spanish weaknesses exploited. Drake, as always, advocates for aggressive action that will seize initiative from Spanish hands and force the enemy to respond to English moves rather than pursuing their own strategic objectives. His proposal reflects both his intimate knowledge of Spanish naval practices and his understanding of how English tactical innovations might be applied on a scale that could prove decisive. Fire ships, Drake argues, represent the key to breaking up the Spanish formation and creating the kind of tactical confusion that English advantages in seamanship and individual ship handling can exploit. The proposal involves risks that make some English commanders hesitate, for fire ships are essentially sacrificial vessels whose loss reduces English numerical strength at a moment when every ship may be needed for the decisive battle. Moreover, the tactic requires precise timing and favorable wind conditions that cannot be guaranteed, while failure might expose English forces to Spanish retaliation without achieving compensating advantages. Yet the strategic logic of Drake's proposal proves compelling when measured against the alternatives available to English forces. Direct assault on the Spanish formation, though heroic, would play to Spanish advantages in size and firepower while negating English superiority in maneuverability. Continued harassment, though tactically successful during the Channel fighting, cannot prevent Spanish coordination with Parma's forces if given sufficient time. Only some dramatic action that disrupts Spanish planning and forces precipitate decisions offers realistic hope of preventing the invasion that English resources alone cannot stop. The decision to employ fire ships reflects English understanding that desperate situations require desperate measures, but also demonstrates confidence in English tactical capabilities that a week of successful fighting has created. Howard authorizes the preparation of 8 vessels for conversion to fire ships, choosing older and less valuable ships whose loss will least reduce English fighting strength. The Elizabeth of Lowestoft, the Bear Young, the Cure, the Hope, the Angel, the Venture, the Elizabeth, and the Thomas sacrificed their future as fighting vessels to serve as instruments of Spanish destruction. The preparation of fire ships requires skills and materials that English crews have acquired through years of experience in every form of naval warfare. Combustible materials tar, pitch, hemp, gunpowder, and anything else that will burn fiercely are loaded into the holds and spread throughout the ship's interiors. Cannon are double-shot and loaded, their muzzles positioned to fire automatically when the heat of the flames reaches the charges, creating additional confusion and danger for Spanish crews attempting to fend off the fire ships. Most importantly, the fire ships are prepared with timing devices that will allow their English crews to escape before the flames reach dangerous intensity. Slow matches, carefully calculated to burn for specific periods, will ignite the main charges after the attacking vessels have been abandoned by their crews. The technique requires precise knowledge of burning rates and wind conditions, but English experience with similar tactics against Spanish shore installations provides the expertise needed for success. The night of August 7th brings conditions that seem almost providentially favorable for the English attack. The wind blows steadily from the west, driving toward the Spanish anchorage with sufficient force to carry fire ships rapidly into the heart of the enemy formation. The tide schedule will aid English approach while hindering Spanish attempts to warp their ships away from danger. Most importantly, the darkness provides concealment for English preparations, while the flames of the fire ships will create maximum psychological impact against Spanish crews already strained by weeks of continuous operations. Spanish lookouts first detect the approaching threat as 8 dark shapes separate themselves from the English fleet and begin moving steadily toward the Armada's anchorage. The vessels appear to be English warships attempting a night attack, a tactic that Spanish defensive planning has anticipated and prepared to counter. Gun crews run to their stations while signal lanterns flash warnings throughout the Spanish formation, but the true nature of the threat only becomes apparent as flames begin to leap from the attacking vessel's rigging and superstructure. The psychological impact of the fire ship attack exceeds even English expectations for its effectiveness. Spanish crews, many of whom have never encountered such tactics, panic at the sight of flaming vessels bearing down on their own ships with apparent supernatural determination. The flames, fed by carefully prepared combustibles, create an inferno that illuminates the entire anchorage, while the heat becomes intense enough to threaten any vessel that remains in close proximity. Spanish attempts at organized resistance collapse as individual ships cut their anchor cables and attempt to escape the immediate danger without regard for formation discipline or overall tactical coordination. The Great Crescent Formation that has held together through a week of English attacks disintegrates within minutes as ship after ship abandons its assigned position to avoid the approaching flames. Some Spanish vessels collide with each other in the darkness and confusion, while others run aground on the treacherous sands that surround the Calais anchorage. The Gallius San Lorenzo suffers the most dramatic casualty when her attempt to escape the fire ships results in grounding on the beach near Calais Castle. Don Hugo de Moncada's flagship, one of the most powerful vessels in the Spanish fleet, becomes helplessly stranded as the falling tide leaves her high and dry within range of English attack. The loss eliminates not only an irreplaceable warship, but also one of Spain's most experienced naval commanders, whose death during English attempts to capture his grounded vessel removes crucial leadership from the surviving Spanish forces. Medina Sidonia himself barely escapes disaster when the San Martin is forced to cut her anchor cables and drift with the tide to avoid the approaching fire ships. The Spanish flagship's retreat, though tactically necessary, provides powerful symbolic evidence that Spanish resolve is cracking under English pressure. More practically, the loss of the Armada's anchors eliminates Spanish ability to maintain position in the Calais roads, forcing the fleet to seek new anchorage in less favorable positions. The morning of August 8th reveals the magnitude of Spanish tactical disaster as the Great Armada, scattered by the night's panic, attempts to reform in the waters off Gravelines. Ships that had maintained perfect formation discipline through a week of English attacks now struggle to regain contact with their squadrons while English forces, emboldened by their success, prepare for what may prove to be the decisive battle of the entire campaign. Spanish casualties from the fire ship attack, though surprisingly light in terms of ships actually destroyed, include losses that will prove irreplaceable during the battles to come. The San Lorenzo's grounding eliminates one of the fleet's most powerful fighting units, while the dispersal of the main formation destroys the mutual support system that Spanish tactical doctrine requires for effective resistance. Most critically, the psychological damage inflicted by English tactical innovation undermines Spanish confidence at precisely the moment when morale will prove most crucial. English morale, by contrast, reaches levels that transform Howard's fleet from a defensive force into an instrument of aggressive attack. The success of the fire ships proves that Spanish formations can be broken and Spanish plans disrupted through English tactical innovation and determination. More importantly, the Spanish retreat provides English forces with the tactical initiative that they have sought throughout the campaign, allowing English commanders to choose when and where to fight the climactic battle on terms that favor English advantages. The strategic situation that emerges from the night's chaos favors English objectives in ways that seemed impossible just hours earlier. Spanish coordination with Parma's forces has been effectively severed, as the Armada's dispersion prevents organized communication with the Netherlands army. Spanish supply problems, already serious, become critical as scattered ships lose contact with their provision vessels and face the prospect of extended operations without adequate food and water. Most importantly for English strategy, the Spanish fleet's loss of formation integrity eliminates the defensive advantages that had protected weaker Spanish vessels from English attack. Individual Spanish ships, no matter how powerful, cannot resist concentrated attack by multiple English vessels, while the breakdown of Spanish tactical coordination prevents effective mutual support during combat operations. The dawn reveals English squadrons forming for attack against Spanish forces that must fight the most crucial battle of the campaign without the formation discipline and tactical coordination that their entire strategic concept requires. The moment of ultimate truth has arrived, and with it the test of whether English tactical innovation and determination can overcome the residual advantages that Spanish individual ship superiority and veteran crews still provide. The battle that is about to begin will determine not only the fate of the Spanish Armada but the future balance of power in European waters, as traditional naval supremacy confronts revolutionary challenges that threaten to reshape maritime warfare itself. Section 8. Gravelines, the decisive battle. The dawn of August 8, 1588, breaks gray and windswept over the shallow waters off Gravelines, where the scattered remnants of the Spanish Armada struggle to reform their shattered formations while English squadrons bear down upon them with the confidence of hunters who have finally driven their quarry into the open. The fire ship attack that broke Spanish discipline during the night has transformed the strategic situation completely, turning what had been an organized retreat into a desperate fight for survival against opponents who now hold every tactical advantage. Lord Howard of Effingham signals for general attack as the English fleet deploys into the battle formation that a week of continuous fighting has perfected through bitter experience. The Ark Royal leads the weather division, taking advantage of the westerly wind to approach the Spanish fleet from the most favorable angle, while Drake in the Revenge commands the lee division that will prevent Spanish escape toward the shallow waters of the Flemish coast. Hawkins and Frobisher coordinate their squadrons to support the main attack, their experienced crews eager to press home the advantages that English tactical innovation has created. The Spanish formation that attempts to meet this assault bears little resemblance to the magnificent crescent that had departed Lisbon with such confidence 3 months earlier. Ships scattered by the night's panic struggle to regain contact with their squadrons while maintaining station against the contrary winds and treacherous currents that characterize these waters. The great supply ships, no longer protected by the disciplined formations of fighting vessels, lumber desperately toward whatever shelter the Flemish coast might provide, their deep-laden hulls making them easy targets for English pursuit. Medina Sidonia himself, aboard the San Martin, faces the most crucial decision of his reluctant career as commander of the great enterprise. The Spanish flagship, having cut her cables during the fire ship attack, now lacks the ground tackle needed to maintain position against the wind and tide that drive inexorably toward the treacherous shoals of the Netherlands coast. The Duke must choose between attempting to rally his scattered forces for a coordinated defense or accepting the inevitability of defeat and trying to save whatever ships can be preserved for future service. The choice becomes academic as English attackers close to decisive range and open the most intensive naval bombardment in the history of European warfare. Howard leads the Ark Royal directly against the San Martin, bringing his flagship's entire battery to bear against the Spanish commander in a personal duel that symbolizes the broader struggle between English innovation and Spanish tradition. The two great ships, representative of their nation's finest naval architecture and most experienced seamanship, exchange broadsides at ranges so close that their cannon muzzles almost touch. The English attack demonstrates all the tactical advantages that a week of fighting has revealed and refined. English guns, served by crews trained in rapid loading and accurate laying, pour shot into Spanish hulls and rigging with devastating effect. The Ark Royal's culverins, firing at their optimal range, smash through the San Martin's elaborate stern castle and scatter deadly splinters throughout the Spanish flagship's crowded decks. English round shot, concentrated on Spanish rigging and steering gear, systematically destroys the Spanish ship's ability to maneuver while maintaining English freedom of action. Spanish resistance, though heroic, cannot match English firepower when fought on terms that English tactical doctrine has designed to exploit. Spanish guns, magnificent pieces of bronze artillery that represent the finest work of royal foundries, prove less effective than their English counterparts when rapid fire and tactical flexibility determine the battle's outcome. Spanish crews, many of them soldiers rather than experienced seamen, struggle with the complex procedures of naval gunnery, while under fire from opponents who have perfected these techniques through years of combat experience. The personal duel between Howard and Medina Sidonia epitomizes the broader tactical revolution that is reshaping naval warfare before the eyes of both fleets. The Spanish commander, trained in traditional concepts of naval combat, expects to close with his opponent and fight a decisive action where superior individual ship strength and disciplined boarding tactics will prove overwhelming. Howard, implementing the innovations that English experience has developed, maintains distance while using superior gunnery and ship handling to inflict cumulative damage that will eventually prove decisive. Drake's attack on the Spanish Lee Division provides even more dramatic evidence of English tactical superiority when applied with ruthless systematic. The Revenge, supported by a line of English race-built galleons, approaches the Spanish formation from downwind, where Spanish ships cannot easily maneuver to avoid combat or support each other against concentrated attack. Drake's target is the great carrack San Felipe, flagship of the Portuguese squadron and one of the most powerful vessels in the Spanish fleet. The San Felipe, displacing nearly 2,000 tons and carrying more than 60 guns, represents everything that Spanish naval philosophy considers essential for victory at sea. Her massive construction can absorb punishment that would destroy smaller vessels, while her heavy armament should enable her to batter any opponent into submission through sheer firepower. Her crew includes some of Portugal's most experienced naval officers, men who have learned their trade in the brutal campaigns that established Portuguese dominion over the Indian Ocean. Yet all these advantages prove insufficient when confronted by English tactical methods that exploit Spanish weaknesses while negating Spanish strengths. Drake approaches from an angle that prevents the San Felipe from bringing her full battery to bear, while English maneuvering keeps the range at distances where English advantages in rate of fire and accuracy prove most telling. The Revenge pours broadside after broadside into the Portuguese flagship's towering sides, each discharge carefully aimed to maximize damage to rigging, steering, and the superstructure where Spanish soldiers cluster. The carrack's response, though impressive in its sound and fury, fails to achieve proportional results against English targets that refuse to remain stationary long enough for Spanish heavy guns to find their mark. Portuguese gunners, trained for close-range combat where their superior individual gun power should prove decisive, find themselves fighting at ranges where English advantages in loading speed and tactical mobility neutralize Spanish material superiority. The destruction of the San Felipe provides the most dramatic individual ship action of the entire battle, as cumulative English damage gradually overwhelms Spanish resistance despite heroic efforts by her crew. Portuguese officers, recognizing that their flagship cannot survive continued punishment, attempt to close with their tormentors and fight the kind of hand-to-hand combat where Spanish training and equipment should provide decisive advantages. But English seamanship prevents the close engagement that Spanish tactics require, while English gunnery continues its systematic destruction of Spanish capability for organized resistance. The San Felipe's mainmast crashes down in a tangle of rigging and canvas. Her steering gear is shot away, and her gun decks are swept by deadly splinters that kill and wound scores of her crew. When the great ship finally strikes her colors in surrender, she has become a shattered hulk whose capture provides powerful evidence of English tactical superiority. Hawkins demonstrates different but equally effective methods when his squadron attacks the Biscayan division, where Juan Martínez de Recalde commands from his flagship Santa Ana. The veteran Spanish admiral, oldest and most experienced of Philip's naval commanders, has spent his career fighting English pirates and privateers in actions that taught him to respect English seamanship while maintaining confidence in Spanish fighting qualities. Now, in what may be his final battle, Recalde faces the ultimate test of traditional Spanish naval methods against revolutionary English innovations. The Santa Ana, though smaller than the Great Carracks, represents the finest traditions of Spanish galleon design and construction. Her lines combine seaworthiness with fighting power, while her crew includes veteran sailors who have learned their trade in decades of service against Spain's enemies. Recalde himself, despite his advanced age and failing health, provides leadership that embodies Spanish naval tradition and professional competence. Yet even these advantages cannot overcome the tactical situation that English innovation has created. Hawkins approaches with mathematical precision, using his knowledge of ballistics and ship handling to maintain optimal range while preventing Spanish retaliation. The Victory, Hawkins's flagship, leads a line of English vessels that coordinate their fire with devastating effectiveness, each ship contributing to a systematic bombardment that gradually overwhelms Spanish defensive capabilities. The battle develops into a gunnery duel that tests the fundamental assumptions both sides have brought to this ultimate confrontation. Spanish confidence in heavy individual guns meets English faith in rapid fire and superior seamanship, while traditional concepts of naval honor confront practical calculations of tactical advantage. The outcome provides decisive evidence about which approach better serves the realities of sailing ship warfare in the late 16th century. Recalde's final stand aboard the battered Santa Ana epitomizes Spanish courage and Spanish tactical limitations with equal clarity. The veteran admiral, wounded by English shot and watching his ship destroyed around him, refuses surrender and continues fighting until English superiority becomes mathematically overwhelming. His resistance inspires Spanish crews throughout the fleet while demonstrating that individual heroism cannot overcome systematic tactical disadvantage. The collapse of Spanish resistance occurs gradually as ship after ship finds itself unable to maintain effective combat against English attack methods that exploit every Spanish weakness while negating Spanish strengths. The San Mateo, pride of the Andalusian squadron, suffers such severe damage that she must be run aground on the Flemish coast to prevent her total loss. The San Juan de Sicilia, flagship of the Levantine squadron, surrenders after her crew can no longer serve her guns effectively. Most dramatically, the great Gallius San Lorenzo, already damaged during the fire ship attack, becomes the target of a coordinated English assault that demonstrates how tactical innovation can overcome even the most formidable individual vessels. The San Lorenzo's combination of sailing power and rowing capability, designed to provide tactical flexibility in variable wind conditions, proves inadequate against English ships that can maintain favorable positions through superior seamanship alone. The Gallius's destruction provides the most visible symbol of Spanish defeat, as the great vessel burns and explodes in shallow water where thousands of observers can witness the final destruction of Spanish naval pretensions. Don Hugo de Moncada's death during the action eliminates one of Spain's most experienced naval commanders while providing English forces with conclusive evidence of their tactical superiority. English casualties during the battle remain remarkably light considering the intensity and duration of the fighting. Superior tactics and ship handling allow English vessels to inflict devastating damage while avoiding the kind of close combat where Spanish advantages in individual ship strength and crew training might prove decisive. English wounded are evacuated to friendly ports where proper medical care is available, while English ships suffer reparable damage that can be remedied in familiar dockyards with adequate supplies and skilled craftsmen. Spanish losses, by contrast, include irreplaceable ships and irreplaceable men whose absence will cripple Spanish naval capabilities for years to come. The great carracks and galleons that represent decades of construction effort and millions of ducats in investment lie shattered on the Flemish coast or in English hands, while Spanish crews trained through years of expensive experience are dead, wounded, or captured. The human cost alone represents a strategic disaster from which Spanish naval power may never fully recover. More immediately, the battle's outcome eliminates any remaining possibility of Spanish coordination with Parma's army for the invasion of England. The Armada's dispersion and the loss of so many fighting ships make organized amphibious assault impossible, while Spanish supply problems have become critical as damaged vessels lose contact with their provision ships. The great enterprise that began with such confidence and preparation has degenerated into a desperate struggle for survival. Spanish morale, maintained through weeks of English harassment and tactical defeat, finally collapses as the magnitude of disaster becomes apparent to officers and men throughout the fleet. Ships that had fought with disciplined courage during the Channel battles now show signs of panic and dissolution as Spanish crews recognize that their situation has become hopeless. Desertion becomes a serious problem as men abandon their posts to seek safety ashore, while discipline breaks down among units that have lost confidence in their commanders and their cause. English morale, by contrast, reaches heights that transform Howard's fleet from a defensive force into an instrument of aggressive pursuit. The tactical victories achieved during the battle provide concrete evidence that English methods can defeat Spanish power when properly applied, while the capture of enemy ships and commanders offers tangible rewards for the risks and sacrifices that English crews have endured. Most importantly, the strategic situation now favors English objectives as Spanish forces face the prospect of retreat without achieving any of their original goals. The wind that has favored English tactical deployment throughout the battle now becomes an enemy to Spanish survival, as the prevailing westerlies drive the damaged armada inexorably toward the treacherous shoals and hostile shores of the Netherlands coast. Spanish ships, many of them barely seaworthy after the day's punishment, face the nightmare of navigation in waters they do not know while pursued by enemies who can choose when and where to continue the attack. Medina Sidonia, surveying the wreckage of his command from the shot-torn deck of the San Martin, faces the most painful decision of his career as he acknowledges that the great enterprise has failed and that Spanish survival now depends on successful retreat rather than victorious advance. The signals that order Spanish withdrawal represent more than tactical necessity. They symbolize the end of Spanish pretensions to unchallenged naval supremacy and the beginning of a new era in European maritime affairs. The Battle of Gravelines concludes as English ships pursue fleeing Spanish vessels into the gathering dusk, harassing retreating enemies while avoiding the kind of decisive night action that might still provide Spanish forces with opportunities for successful retaliation. English tactical discipline, maintained throughout the campaign, prevents the kind of reckless pursuit that might snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. As darkness falls over the battlefield littered with wreckage and Spanish dead, both fleets begin to comprehend the full magnitude of what has occurred in these shallow waters off the Flemish coast. The greatest naval expedition in history has met decisive defeat, not through superior numbers or overwhelming force, but through tactical innovation and systematic exploitation of opponent weaknesses that traditional military thinking had failed to anticipate. The morning will reveal the full extent of Spanish disaster and English triumph, but already the strategic implications are clear to commanders on both sides. Spanish naval supremacy, unchallenged for half a century, has been broken by English tactical revolution and superior seamanship. The balance of power in European waters has shifted irrevocably, with consequences that will reshape international relations for generations to come. Section 9. The Great Storm God's Protestant Wind. The battered remnants of the Spanish Armada that flee northward from the carnage at Gravelines face a navigation nightmare that will test seamanship, endurance, and sheer survival instinct beyond any limits that Philip's planners could have imagined. With the English Channel closed behind them and the North Sea stretching ahead like a gray wilderness of unknown perils, Medina Sidonia must choose between impossible alternatives. Attempting to fight his way back through English-controlled waters to reach friendly Spanish ports, or gambling everything on the untested northern route around Scotland and Ireland that Spanish charts barely acknowledge and Spanish pilots have never attempted. The decision, when it comes, reflects both Spanish desperation and the Duke's growing understanding that conventional naval wisdom no longer applies to his situation. The English fleet, though temporarily content to shadow the Spanish retreat rather than risk further battle, maintains such tactical superiority that any attempt to return through the Channel would result in the Armada's complete destruction. The northern route, despite its unknown dangers and appalling distance, offers the only possibility of preserving some portion of Philip's great investment for future service. The strategic choice commits the surviving Spanish ships to a voyage of more than 2,000 miles through waters that European navigation has barely explored, past coasts where no Spanish ship has ever sought shelter, in vessels damaged by weeks of combat and overcrowded with men already weakened by combat stress and inadequate provisions. The enterprise that began as a confident assertion of Spanish naval supremacy has degenerated into a desperate struggle for survival against odds that grow worse with each passing day. Spanish charts of the northern seas, such as they exist, derive from fragmentary reports by fishing vessels and occasional merchant expeditions that ventured beyond the familiar waters of European commerce. The coastlines of Scotland and Ireland appear as vague sketches rather than reliable navigational aids, while the positions of reefs, shoals, and safe harbors remain largely matters of conjecture. Even the magnetic variations that affect compass readings in these latitudes are unknown quantities that Spanish navigators must estimate through theoretical calculations rather than practical experience. Weather patterns in the North Atlantic, infinitely more severe than the relatively benign conditions of Mediterranean and Channel navigation, present challenges that Spanish ship design and Spanish seamanship are ill-equipped to handle. The great carracks and galleons, magnificent in the protected waters of southern Europe, prove unwieldy and vulnerable when confronted by the massive swells and contrary winds that characterize the Northern Ocean. Their high castles, impressive in battle and useful for intimidating opponents, become liabilities in heavy weather where low centers of gravity and streamlined profiles determine survival. The human cost of the Northern Passage begins to mount even before the fleet clears the relatively sheltered waters around the Orkney Islands. Spanish casualties during the Channel fighting, though not catastrophic in absolute terms, have eliminated many of the fleet's most experienced officers and skilled seamen. The men who remain, already exhausted by weeks of continuous operations, must now master the complexities of long-range navigation in unfamiliar waters while dealing with increasingly severe weather conditions. Food spoilage, a persistent problem since the fleet's departure from Lisbon, accelerates dramatically in the damp conditions of northern waters. Spanish provisions, calculated for a brief channel crossing followed by rapid conquest of English ports, prove totally inadequate for the extended voyage that circumstances have forced upon the fleet. Biscuit becomes moldy and inedible, salt pork spoils despite careful preservation efforts, and wine sours in casks that develop leaks from the constant working of ship timbers in heavy seas. Water supplies present even more critical problems as Spanish ships venture into regions where fresh water cannot be easily obtained. The casks that should contain pure drinking water become contaminated with bilge water and seawater, while damaged vessels can no longer maintain the pumping schedules needed to keep their holds dry. Spanish crews, working constantly to keep their ships afloat, require far more water than normal planning had provided, while the salt spray and physical exertion of heavy weather sailing increase their physiological needs beyond sustainable levels. Medical problems multiply as the fleet encounters weather conditions that tax human endurance beyond its limits. Scurvy, typhus, and dysentery spread rapidly through overcrowded ships where proper sanitation becomes impossible to maintain. Spanish surgeons, trained for land campaigns where wounded men can be evacuated to proper hospitals, find themselves overwhelmed by the combination of combat casualties, epidemic disease, and the injuries that inevitably result from working damaged ships in heavy weather. The first of the great storms that will characterize the Northern Passage strikes the Spanish fleet as it attempts to round the northern coast of Scotland, where the Atlantic swells encounter the complex geography of the Highland coast and create sea conditions that challenge even experienced local navigators. Spanish ships, scattered by weeks of fighting and struggling to maintain formation in increasingly heavy weather, find themselves isolated and vulnerable as wind and wave combine to test every aspect of their construction and seamanship. The storm builds gradually through the gray afternoon of August 20th, as Spanish lookouts observe the characteristic signs of severe weather developing. The long, slow swells that indicate distant disturbances, the peculiar light that presages violent wind, the behavior of seabirds that suggests atmospheric upheaval. Spanish officers, many of whom have never experienced North Atlantic weather conditions, underestimate the severity of what approaches and fail to take the precautions that might preserve their ships when the full fury of the storm breaks upon them. The wind, when it finally arrives, exceeds anything in Spanish experience for its sustained violence and constantly shifting direction. Gusts that would challenge any vessel become steady blows that threaten to dismast ships or drive them helplessly toward the rocky shores of the Scottish Highlands. Spanish crews, already exhausted by weeks of continuous operations, must work in conditions where a single mistake or moment of inattention can result in death or the loss of their vessel. The great Carrack El Gran Griffin, flagship of the supply squadron and one of the largest vessels in the fleet, provides a tragic example of how Spanish ships and Spanish seamanship prove inadequate for northern waters. The massive vessel, designed for the relatively calm conditions of southern European seas, becomes unmanageable in the steep swells and contrary winds of the Northern Ocean. Her high castles, magnificent in harbor and useful in battle, create windage that makes steering nearly impossible, while her deep draft prevents escape into the shallow coastal waters where smaller vessels might find shelter. The Gran Griffin's struggle against the storm epitomizes the broader Spanish predicament as traditional methods of seamanship prove inadequate for conditions that Spanish training and experience have never encountered. Spanish officers, trained in Mediterranean navigation where landmarks are visible and weather patterns predictable, find themselves lost in a gray wilderness where compass variations, uncertain charts, and constantly changing conditions make accurate position finding almost impossible. The ship's destruction, when it finally comes after days of desperate effort, occurs not through dramatic collision with rocks or reefs, but through the gradual accumulation of damage that overwhelms Spanish capability for damage control. Sails blow out faster than they can be replaced, rigging parts under stress that Spanish engineering had not anticipated, and hull planking works loose from the constant flexing of the ship's structure in heavy seas. When the Gran Griffin finally grounds on the rocky coast of Fair Isle, between Orkney and Shetland, her crew faces the additional nightmare of survival on a hostile shore where no Spanish authority exists and local inhabitants view shipwrecked foreigners as potential threats rather than objects of Christian charity. The contrast with Spanish expectations could not be more complete. Men who had embarked as conquerors of England find themselves begging for food and shelter from Scottish islanders whose poverty makes Spanish hardships seem luxurious by comparison. Similar disasters multiply throughout the fleet as Spanish ships encounter weather conditions and navigational challenges that exceed their design capabilities and their crew's experience. The Gallius Girona, attempting to seek shelter in Irish waters, suffers progressive damage that transforms one of the fleet's most powerful fighting vessels into a waterlogged hulk barely capable of staying afloat. Her combination of sails and oars, so effective in Mediterranean conditions, proves useless in North Atlantic swells where rowing becomes impossible and sail handling requires constant attention. The Girona's final destruction off the Irish coast provides one of the most dramatic individual tragedies of the entire Northern Passage. The great vessel, crowded with survivors from other wrecked ships, carries more than 1,300 souls when she finally loses her battle against wind and wave. Her grounding on the rocks near the Giant's Causeway kills all but 9 of those aboard, including some of the finest officers and gentlemen of Spanish service. The human stories that emerge from these disasters reveal both Spanish courage and the inadequacy of Spanish preparation for the conditions they encounter. Don Alonso de Leyva, one of Philip's most trusted commanders and originally intended to lead the land campaign in England, survives the wreck of his own flagship only to die when the Girona breaks apart on the Irish rocks. His death eliminates not only an irreplaceable military leader but also a symbol of Spanish noble service that had inspired loyalty throughout the fleet. Individual tales of survival and death multiply as Spanish ships encounter the Irish coast, where local geography creates particularly treacherous conditions for vessels seeking shelter. The western shores of Ireland present a coastline of unprecedented danger, where Atlantic swells have traveled thousands of miles to crash against cliffs and reefs with devastating force. Spanish pilots, lacking local knowledge and working with inadequate charts, make navigation errors that prove fatal when attempted in such conditions. The great ship Duquesa Santa Ana, carrying more than 1,000 souls, becomes one of the most tragic casualties when her attempt to find shelter in Donegal Bay results in total loss on the rocky shore near Killibugs. The ship's destruction occurs within sight of land that should have provided salvation, but Spanish inability to assess local conditions accurately transforms potential rescue into certain disaster. Spanish survivors who reach Irish shores alive face additional challenges that Spanish planning had never considered. Ireland in 1588 remains a conquered territory where English authority is contested by Gaelic chieftains who owe no loyalty to Elizabeth's government. Spanish castaways find themselves caught between hostile English officials who view them as enemy invaders and Irish locals whose attitudes toward Spanish Catholics vary dramatically depending on political and personal circumstances. Some Spanish survivors receive assistance from Irish Catholics who view them as fellow believers worthy of Christian charity despite their military mission. Others encounter suspicion and hostility from Irish communities that fear English retaliation for helping Spanish forces. The complex political situation in Ireland, where religious loyalty conflicts with practical considerations and where English authority remains incomplete, creates a chaotic environment where Spanish survival depends largely on luck and individual circumstances. English policy towards Spanish survivors reveals the calculated ruthlessness that characterizes Elizabethan strategy throughout the Armada campaign. Official instructions to English commanders in Ireland emphasize that Spanish soldiers and sailors are to be treated as enemy invaders rather than shipwrecked mariners deserving humanitarian assistance. The policy reflects English understanding that showing mercy to Spanish forces might encourage future invasion attempts, while harsh treatment will serve as a deterrent to Spanish adventurism. The systematic execution of Spanish prisoners in Ireland, though shocking by modern humanitarian standards, represents logical implementation of 16th-century military practice where quarter is rarely given to enemy forces caught in hostile territory. English commanders like Sir William Fitzwilliam and Sir Richard Bingham organized the hunting down and killing of Spanish survivors with methodical efficiency that eliminates any possibility of Spanish regrouping or escape. Yet even English ruthlessness cannot prevent individual Spanish successes in evading capture and eventual repatriation to Spain. Spanish officers who possess sufficient resources and connections sometimes manage to negotiate passage to Scottish ports where their noble status provides protection from English persecution. Spanish sailors who can prove their non-combatant status occasionally receive relatively lenient treatment that allows eventual return to Spain through prisoner exchanges. The weather that drives Spanish ships to destruction along the Irish coast reflects broader climatic patterns that make 1588 a particularly difficult year for North Atlantic navigation. The summer storms that characterize the Northern Passage represent unusual weather conditions rather than normal seasonal patterns, adding an element of exceptional bad luck to Spanish misfortunes that were already severe enough under ordinary circumstances. Modern meteorological analysis suggests that the storms encountered by the Spanish fleet represent the intersection of several weather systems that created unusually severe conditions in the North Atlantic during late summer 1588. The combination of tropical storms generated in lower latitudes with polar air masses moving south creates the kind of sustained violent weather that challenges even modern shipping equipped with advanced navigation and communication systems. Spanish ships, designed for different climatic conditions and lacking the meteorological knowledge needed to predict or avoid severe weather, become victims of natural forces that no amount of human courage or skill can overcome. The irony that Spanish Catholic forces should suffer such systematic destruction from weather conditions that English Protestant propaganda will celebrate as divine intervention provides a final twist to a campaign that has already exceeded all expectations for its drama and decisiveness. The survivors who finally reached Spanish ports in October and November 1588 represent perhaps half of the 30,000 men who had departed with such confidence 4 months earlier. Their testimonies, recorded by Spanish officials trying to understand the magnitude of disaster that has befallen Philip's great enterprise, reveal the systematic breakdown of Spanish naval power under pressure from English tactical innovation and North Atlantic weather conditions. Ships that returned to Spanish harbors bear little resemblance to the magnificent vessels that had departed from Lisbon with such ceremony and confidence. Hulls are shattered by storm damage and English gunfire. Rigging is improvised from whatever materials could be found, and crews are decimated by combat casualties, disease, and the brutal attrition of the Northern Passage. The physical evidence of Spanish defeat provides powerful testimony to the effectiveness of English strategy and the inadequacy of Spanish preparation for the kind of campaign that circumstances forced upon them. The human cost of the Northern Passage exceeds even the material losses in its long-term impact on Spanish naval capabilities. The death of experienced officers and skilled seamen represents an irreplaceable loss that will cripple Spanish naval effectiveness for years to come. The psychological impact on survivors creates a crisis of confidence that undermines Spanish belief in their naval superiority and their ability to challenge English power in future conflicts. Most importantly for the broader strategic situation, the disaster of the Northern Passage eliminates any immediate possibility of renewed Spanish invasion attempts against England. The ships and men lost during the retreat cannot be quickly replaced, while the magnitude of Spanish defeat provides English forces with breathing space to consolidate their tactical advantages and prepare for future challenges to their newfound naval supremacy. The great storm that completes the destruction of Spanish hopes represents more than mere weather. It symbolizes the intersection of human planning with natural forces, of religious conviction with practical reality, of imperial ambition with the harsh facts of geography and seamanship. The Spanish Armada's fate in the gray waters of the North Atlantic provides a dramatic conclusion to the most ambitious military enterprise of the 16th century and marks the beginning of a new era in European maritime affairs. Section 10. Aftermath and Consequences. The world transformed. The winter of 1588 settles over Europe like a shroud, carrying with it news that will reshape the political and religious balance of the Western world. In the austere chambers of the Escorial, Philip II receives the final tallies of his great enterprise with the stoic resignation that has characterized his reign. But even his legendary self-control cannot entirely mask the magnitude of disaster that has befallen Spanish arms. Of the 130 ships that departed Lisbon with such magnificent ceremony, barely half have limped back to Spanish ports, and those in condition so damaged that many will never sail again. The human cost proves even more devastating than the material losses. 15,000 Spanish soldiers and sailors lie dead in English waters, on Irish beaches, or in unmarked graves across the northern seas, their bodies testimony to the futility of challenging English naval supremacy with traditional methods that proved inadequate for revolutionary circumstances. The officers and gentlemen who perished represent decades of accumulated experience and training that cannot be quickly replaced, while the skilled seamen lost during the campaign constitute an irreplaceable reservoir of maritime expertise. Philip's reaction to these reports reveals both the character that has made him Europe's most formidable monarch and the limitations that have led to this unprecedented defeat. The king accepts responsibility for the disaster with characteristic dignity, acknowledging that human planning cannot always anticipate divine will, but his private correspondence reveals profound bewilderment at how Spanish superiority in numbers and resources could have proven insufficient against English tactical innovation and determination. The financial implications of the Armada's destruction stagger even Spanish resources that have grown accustomed to the enormous costs of European warfare. The direct expense of building, equipping, and manning the great fleet approaches 4 million ducats, while the indirect costs of disrupted commerce and defensive preparations throughout the empire add millions more to the final accounting. Most seriously, the loss of so many ships eliminates Spanish capability for future naval enterprises at precisely the moment when English confidence and capability reach levels that threaten Spanish commerce throughout the world. Spanish strategic planning must now confront realities that the Armada's failure has created. English naval power, proven effective against the greatest fleet in history, can no longer be dismissed as the product of piratical opportunism or temporary tactical advantage. The systematic defeat of Spanish formations and the capture of Spanish ships demonstrate that English innovations in ship design, gunnery, and tactical doctrine represent fundamental advances that traditional Spanish methods cannot counter through sheer numerical superiority. The psychological impact of Spanish defeat resonates throughout Catholic Europe, where Philip's subjects and allies had confidently expected English submission to inevitable Spanish conquest. The failure of the great enterprise raises troubling questions about divine providence and Spanish destiny that challenge basic assumptions about the relationship between religious faith and military success. If God truly favors Catholic causes, how could the most Catholic of kings suffer such complete defeat at the hands of heretical English pirates? Protestant Europe, by contrast, celebrates the Armada's destruction with religious fervor that transforms English victory into a providential demonstration of divine favor for Reformed Christianity. The storm that completed Spanish destruction becomes God's Protestant wind, while English tactical success proves that divine protection extends to those who reject papal authority and embrace biblical truth. The propaganda value of Spanish defeat provides Protestant powers with powerful ammunition for future conflicts with Catholic opponents. Elizabeth's government exploits English victory with sophisticated propaganda campaigns that transform tactical success into strategic advantage. The Queen's famous speech at Tilbury, delivered to English troops assembled to repel invasion that never came, becomes a masterpiece of political theater that celebrates both English courage and divine protection. Her declaration that she has the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, resonates through English society as evidence that female rule can provide leadership equal to any male monarch. The economic consequences of Spanish defeat extend far beyond immediate military considerations to reshape the balance of European commerce and colonial expansion. Spanish control of Atlantic trade routes, unchallenged for nearly a century, becomes vulnerable to English challenge as Spanish naval weakness encourages privateering expeditions that had previously been too dangerous to attempt. English merchants, emboldened by evidence of Spanish vulnerability, begin planning commercial ventures that challenge Spanish monopolies in both the Old World and the New. Dutch independence, sustained through decades of Spanish siege warfare, receives crucial breathing space as Spanish resources must be diverted from Netherlands campaigns to rebuild naval capabilities destroyed during the Armada campaign. The United Provinces, freed from immediate pressure of Spanish reconquest, can consolidate their republican government and expand their commercial activities throughout European markets that Spanish defeat has opened to non-Spanish competition. French policy, carefully balanced between support for Catholic Spain and concern about Spanish hegemony, shifts subtly toward accommodation with English power that can no longer be ignored as a peripheral factor in European politics. Henry III government, struggling with internal religious conflicts that drain French resources, cannot ignore the strategic implications of English naval supremacy for future French security and commercial interests. The technological revolution in naval warfare that English victory represents spreads rapidly throughout European maritime powers, as Spanish defeat provides conclusive evidence that traditional ship design and tactical doctrine require fundamental revision. Dutch, French, and even Venetian naval architects begin studying English innovations in hull design, armament, and crew training that proved so effective against Spanish traditional methods. English ship design, vindicated by combat success against the world's most powerful navy, becomes the model for European naval development during the following decades. The race-built galleon, optimized for speed and firepower rather than passenger capacity or cargo space, establishes principles that will influence warship construction throughout the Age of Sail. English innovations in gunnery, particularly the emphasis on rapid fire and medium-range accuracy, transform naval combat from boarding actions to artillery duels. The strategic balance in Ireland, where Spanish hopes for Catholic uprising had provided crucial support for invasion planning, shifts decisively toward English control as Spanish defeat eliminates external support for Gallic resistance. Irish chieftains who had counted on Spanish military assistance find themselves isolated and vulnerable to English campaigns that no longer need to guard against invasion from the sea. Spanish commercial empire, dependent on naval protection for treasure fleets and merchant shipping, faces systematic challenge from English privateers who no longer fear Spanish naval retaliation. The silver routes from America, the spice trade from Asia, and the African slave commerce all become vulnerable to English attack as Spanish convoy escorts prove inadequate for protecting commerce against opponents who have demonstrated clear tactical superiority in ship-to-ship combat. The religious implications of Spanish defeat extend beyond immediate military considerations to influence the broader development of European Christianity. Catholic confidence in inevitable triumph over Protestant heresy suffers a blow that encourages Protestant powers to resist Spanish pressure and maintain reformed religious practices. The Counter-Reformation, dependent on Spanish military power for its success, must confront the reality that Protestant England has proven capable of defeating Catholic Europe's greatest military force. English national identity undergoes fundamental transformation as victory over the Spanish Armada provides evidence of divine favor and national destiny that will influence English attitudes for centuries. The defeat of invasion creates a national myth of English invincibility at sea that encourages maritime expansion and colonial adventure. English confidence in their naval superiority becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that drives continued innovation and aggressive competition with European rivals. The colonial implications of Spanish naval weakness become apparent as English expeditions begin probing Spanish territories that had previously been too well defended to challenge. Walter Raleigh's ventures in Guyana, English exploration of North American coasts, and gradual English penetration of Caribbean waters all reflect confidence that Spanish retaliation will prove ineffective against English naval capabilities. Spanish efforts to rebuild naval strength face obstacles that did not exist before the Armada's destruction. Experienced shipwrights and naval architects, lost during the campaign, cannot be quickly replaced, while Spanish finances, strained by decades of European warfare, cannot support immediate reconstruction of naval forces. Most seriously, Spanish morale and confidence require time to recover from the psychological impact of such comprehensive defeat. The diplomatic revolution that follows Spanish defeat encourages realignment of European alliances that had previously been dominated by Spanish power. German Protestant princes, French Huguenots, and Dutch Republicans all gain confidence from English demonstration that Spanish power can be challenged successfully. The balance of European politics shifts from Spanish hegemony toward multipolar competition that will characterize the following century. English foreign policy, previously defensive and reactive, becomes increasingly aggressive as English leaders recognize that Spanish weakness provides opportunities for territorial and commercial expansion that may never recur. English intervention in European conflicts, English colonial ventures, and English commercial competition all reflect confidence that Spanish power cannot effectively retaliate against English initiatives. The technological diffusion that results from English victory spreads naval innovations throughout Europe as other powers attempt to replicate English tactical advantages. Shipbuilding techniques, gunnery methods, and crew training systems all become subjects for international study and imitation. The naval revolution that English victory represents transforms European military technology and strategic thinking throughout the maritime powers. Spanish strategic doctrine, forced to confront the inadequacy of traditional methods, begins painful reassessment of naval policy and tactical principles that had served Spanish interests effectively for decades. Spanish reliance on heavy ships and boarding tactics gives way gradually to English-influenced emphasis on firepower and maneuverability, though Spanish implementation of these lessons proves slow and incomplete. The global implications of Spanish defeat extend beyond European waters to influence colonial development and commercial competition throughout the world's oceans. Spanish control of Pacific routes faces challenge from English expeditions that Spanish naval weakness can no longer prevent, while Spanish monopolies in American trade become vulnerable to systematic English challenge. The Armada's failure marks not merely a tactical defeat or temporary setback, but a fundamental shift in the balance of European power that will influence international relations for generations. Spanish hegemony, based on naval supremacy and unlimited resources from American colonies, gives way to multipolar competition where English naval power provides counterweight to Spanish territorial control and French military strength. The transformation of European politics that results from Spanish naval defeat creates the foundation for the complex international system that will characterize the early modern period. English naval supremacy, Dutch commercial expansion, French territorial ambitions, and Spanish defensive retrenchment establish patterns of competition and cooperation that will define European relations through the age of absolutism and beyond. The lessons of 1588 resonate through military and political thinking as evidence that technological innovation and tactical flexibility can overcome numerical superiority and traditional methods. The principles that English victory established, the importance of firepower over boarding, speed over size, professional crews over pressed men, become fundamental axioms of naval warfare that influence maritime strategy throughout the Age of Sail. Most importantly, the Armada's destruction demonstrates that even the greatest military enterprises can fail when strategic planning proves inadequate for the conditions actually encountered. Spanish confidence in traditional methods and numerical superiority proved insufficient when confronted by English innovation and systematic preparation for revolutionary warfare. The lesson applies not only to naval combat but to all forms of military and political competition where established powers face challenge from innovative opponents who refuse to accept conventional limitations. Section 11. Historical Analysis: Why the Armada Failed. As historians have studied the Spanish Armada campaign across more than 4 centuries, the question that continues to fascinate scholars and military analysts remains deceptively simple. How did the greatest naval expedition in history meet such complete and devastating defeat? The answer, like most historical truths, proves far more complex than contemporary observers on either side fully understood, involving the intersection of technological change, strategic miscalculation, tactical innovation, and the unpredictable role of weather and geography in determining human destiny. The fundamental strategic flaw in Spanish planning lay in the assumption that naval warfare in the late 16th century would continue to follow patterns established during the Mediterranean conflicts that had shaped Spanish tactical doctrine for generations. Spanish commanders, trained in galley warfare against Turkish opponents, conceived of naval combat as an extension of land warfare where disciplined infantry formations and boarding tactics would prove decisive once opposing fleets came to close quarters. This approach had served Spanish interests effectively in the confined waters of the Mediterranean, where galley tactics and traditional methods could be applied successfully. But the English Channel and North Sea presented entirely different conditions that Spanish experience had not prepared them to handle. The Atlantic sailing ship warfare that developed during the 16th century required different skills, different tactics, and different strategic thinking than the galley combat that had dominated Mediterranean naval warfare. Spanish failure to appreciate these differences, or to adapt their methods accordingly, created vulnerabilities that English innovation systematically exploited. English tactical revolution, by contrast, reflected careful analysis of Spanish strengths and weaknesses based on years of practical experience gained through privateering expeditions against Spanish commerce. English sea captains like Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher had learned Spanish capabilities and limitations through actual combat, while Spanish commanders knew English methods only through theoretical study and occasional encounters with individual English vessels. This disparity in practical experience gave English forces crucial advantages in understanding how to exploit Spanish tactical inflexibility. The ship design revolution that underpinned English tactical success represented a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between naval architecture and combat effectiveness. Spanish ships, designed as floating fortresses capable of absorbing tremendous punishment while delivering devastating firepower at close range, proved inadequate for the kind of long-range artillery combat that English tactics imposed on the campaign. English race-built galleons, optimized for speed and maneuverability rather than passenger capacity or intimidating appearance, could choose when and where to engage while avoiding the close combat where Spanish advantages might prove decisive. Gunnery doctrine reflected these design differences in ways that proved crucial during the actual fighting. Spanish heavy artillery, magnificent for battering fortifications or smashing through ship construction at point-blank range, lacked the accuracy and rate of fire needed for medium-range combat where most of the Channel fighting occurred. English culverins, though individually less powerful than Spanish guns, could be served more rapidly and aimed more accurately, creating cumulative damage that gradually overwhelmed Spanish defensive capabilities. The human element in naval warfare proved equally important as technological factors in determining the campaign's outcome. English crews, drawn largely from volunteers with extensive experience in privateering expeditions, possessed specialized skills and high morale that Spanish-pressed men could not match. Spanish ships, manned by soldiers temporarily assigned to maritime duties and landsmen impressed from Iberian ports, lacked the professional competence needed for complex naval operations under combat conditions. Leadership differences reflected these contrasting approaches to naval warfare and crew selection. English commanders like Drake and Hawkins had learned their profession through years of independent command in hostile waters, where survival depended on tactical innovation and superior seamanship. Spanish officers, though brave and experienced in traditional forms of naval combat, had not been trained for the kind of revolutionary warfare that English methods represented. The logistical challenges that ultimately proved fatal to Spanish hopes resulted from fundamental miscalculations about the nature and duration of the campaign required for English conquest. Spanish supply planning, adequate for a brief channel crossing followed by rapid victory, proved catastrophically insufficient for the extended operations that English resistance imposed on the invasion forces. Food spoilage, water contamination, and medical problems multiplied beyond Spanish capability for management once the campaign extended beyond its originally planned duration. Coordination problems between Spanish sea and land forces revealed another crucial weakness in the grand strategic concept that Philip's planners had developed. The enterprise of England required precise timing and flawless communication between Medina Sidonia's fleet and Parma's army, but Spanish communication systems proved inadequate for maintaining coordination across the distances and hostile territory that separated the two forces. English control of the Channel and Dutch rebel activity in the Netherlands created barriers to Spanish coordination that proved insurmountable under combat conditions. Weather and geography, though often dismissed as factors beyond human control, actually reflected Spanish failure to understand the environmental conditions in which their campaign would be fought. Spanish planners, familiar with Mediterranean and southern European conditions, underestimated both the navigational challenges of northern waters and the severity of North Atlantic weather patterns. English commanders, operating in familiar waters with intimate knowledge of local conditions, could exploit geographical advantages that Spanish inexperience prevented them from anticipating or countering. The role of intelligence and information in determining campaign outcomes highlights another area where English advantages proved decisive. English spy networks, developed through decades of religious and political conflict, provided detailed and accurate information about Spanish preparations, capabilities, and intentions. Spanish intelligence about English forces, by contrast, proved systematically inadequate, leading to miscalculations about English naval strength, tactical methods, and popular support for resistance. Religious and political factors, while often emphasized in contemporary accounts, played more subtle roles in determining military outcomes than either Spanish or English propaganda suggested. Spanish confidence in divine support may have discouraged the kind of careful practical preparation that successful military operations require, while English Protestant motivation provided psychological advantages that translated into superior performance under combat stress. The financial dimensions of the campaign reveal how economic resources, though important, cannot guarantee success without effective strategic planning and tactical execution. Spanish expenditure on the Armada exceeded English naval spending by enormous margins, yet Spanish financial superiority proved insufficient to overcome English advantages in ship design, crew training, and tactical doctrine. Spanish tactical inflexibility, rooted in successful experience with traditional methods, prevented effective adaptation to the revolutionary conditions that English innovation created. Spanish formations, though disciplined and impressive, could not respond effectively to English harassment tactics because Spanish doctrine had not anticipated the need for such tactical flexibility. English formations, by contrast, maintained the coherence needed for mutual support while allowing individual ships sufficient freedom of action to exploit tactical opportunities. The cumulative effect of English tactical advantages, individually modest, proved overwhelming when applied systematically throughout the campaign. No single English innovation was sufficient to guarantee victory, but the combination of superior ship design, better gunnery, more experienced crews, improved tactics, and intimate knowledge of local conditions created insurmountable Spanish disadvantages. Strategic objectives, clearly defined on both sides, influenced tactical decisions in ways that favored English defensive advantages over Spanish offensive requirements. English strategy required only the prevention of successful Spanish invasion, allowing English commanders to avoid decisive battle and concentrate on disrupting Spanish plans. Spanish strategy demanded active conquest of English territory, forcing Spanish commanders to accept battle under conditions that English tactical doctrine was designed to exploit. The learning curve during the campaign itself revealed how adaptability and tactical flexibility could influence outcomes even after initial strategic decisions had been made. English forces demonstrated systematic improvement in coordination and effectiveness as the campaign progressed, while Spanish forces showed signs of declining morale and increasing tactical confusion despite their individual courage and professional competence. Communication and command systems, crucial for coordinating complex military operations, favored English advantages in several important ways. English commanders operated in familiar territory with established communication networks, while Spanish forces depended on improvised systems that proved vulnerable to disruption. English signal procedures, developed through years of cooperative privateering ventures, enabled tactical coordination that Spanish commanders could not achieve with their more traditional hierarchical methods. The role of technological innovation in military affairs, demonstrated dramatically during the Armada campaign, provides lessons that extend far beyond naval warfare to influence broader understanding of how established powers respond to revolutionary challenges. Spanish failure to appreciate the implications of English innovations or to develop effective countermeasures illustrates how technological superiority can be neutralized by tactical revolution and strategic adaptation. International factors, though peripheral to the immediate military campaign, influenced its outcome by affecting resource allocation and strategic priorities on both sides. Spanish involvement in European conflicts limited the resources available for English operations, while English support from Dutch rebels and French Protestants provided indirect assistance that complicated Spanish planning. The question of alternative outcomes, always speculative but historically important, suggests that Spanish success was never impossible despite the tactical and strategic advantages that English preparation created. Different weather conditions, more effective Spanish adaptation to English methods, or successful coordination between Spanish sea and land forces might have produced entirely different results with profound implications for European history. Ultimately, the Spanish Armada's failure resulted from the intersection of multiple factors that individually might have been overcome but collectively proved insurmountable. Spanish strategic planning, adequate for traditional forms of naval warfare, proved insufficient for the revolutionary conditions that English innovation created. Spanish tactical doctrine, successful in Mediterranean conflicts, could not adapt quickly enough to counter English methods that exploited every Spanish weakness while negating Spanish strengths. The lessons of 1588 extend beyond maritime history to provide insights into how military innovation, strategic planning, and tactical adaptation interact to determine outcomes in any form of organized conflict. The Armada's defeat demonstrates that numerical superiority and superior resources cannot guarantee success without effective leadership, appropriate tactics, and realistic assessment of the conditions under which campaigns must be fought. Section 12. Legacy and Memory. The Armada in History. And so, as you drift towards sleep on this quiet night, let your mind rest upon the extraordinary transformation that the defeat of the Spanish Armada brought to the world. In the centuries that followed that fateful summer of 1588, the story of those desperate battles in the English Channel would be told and retold, mythologized and analyzed, celebrated and mourned, until it became something larger than history, a legend that would shape how nations understood their destiny and their place in the great sweep of human events. For England, the Armada's defeat became the founding myth of maritime supremacy, the moment when a small island kingdom discovered that it possessed the power to challenge the greatest empire on earth and emerge victorious. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, until Drake's game of bowls became a symbol of English sang-froid under pressure. The fire ships became instruments of divine wrath, and the storms that scattered Spanish survivors became proof positive that God himself favored Protestant England over Catholic Spain. Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury, delivered to troops who would never see battle because the invasion had already failed, became one of the most quoted addresses in English history. Her declaration that she had the heart and stomach of a king resonated through generations of English rulers who found in her words both inspiration and justification for their own imperial ambitions. The Virgin Queen who defied the world's greatest power became the template for English exceptionalism. The belief that England's island nature and Protestant faith made it uniquely qualified to lead the world toward freedom and enlightenment. The medals struck to commemorate English victory bore the inscription, "God breathed and they were scattered," a phrase that captured perfectly the English interpretation of events. In English memory, the Armada's defeat proved that divine providence protected Protestant England from Catholic persecution, that the natural order of things favored English liberty over Spanish tyranny, and that England's naval destiny was written in the stars themselves. This triumphant narrative served crucial political purposes as England evolved from a defensive island kingdom into an aggressive maritime empire. When English colonies spread across North America, when English trade networks spanned the globe, when English ships patrolled every ocean, the defeat of the Spanish Armada provided historical justification for English expansion. If God had protected Little England from Spanish conquest, surely he also favored English dominion over Spanish territories and Spanish trade routes. The legend of Drake's drum, said to beat whenever England faced mortal danger, embodied this mythological transformation of historical events. The great sea captain's ghost, summoned by supernatural percussion, would return to defend England whenever foreign enemies threatened the realm. The drum reportedly sounded during the Napoleonic Wars, during both World Wars, and at every moment when English courage and seamanship were tested against seemingly impossible odds. But the Spanish perspective on these events tells a different story, one of tragic heroism and noble failure rather than divine retribution and Protestant triumph. In Spanish memory, the Armada represented the high water mark of Catholic Christianity's struggle against heretical innovation, a moment when the most Christian king attempted to restore religious unity to a divided Europe and was thwarted by storms, treachery, and the inscrutable will of God. Spanish accounts of the campaign emphasized the courage of individual commanders like Recalde and Valdez, the discipline of Spanish crews under impossible conditions, and the heroic deaths of Spanish nobles who sacrificed their lives for faith and king. The disasters that befell Spanish ships on Irish coasts became stories of martyrdom rather than military failure, while the storms that completed Spanish destruction were seen as tests of faith rather than evidence of divine displeasure. Philip II himself, in his private correspondence, maintained that the enterprise had been undertaken for the glory of God and the good of Christendom, and that its failure reflected divine will rather than human inadequacy. The king's stoic acceptance of disaster, his immediate planning for future expeditions against English heretics, and his continued support for Catholic causes throughout Europe demonstrated Spanish determination to view the Armada's defeat as a temporary setback rather than a permanent transformation of European power relationships. Spanish naval architecture and tactical doctrine evolved slowly in response to the lessons of 1588, but Spanish strategic thinking never fully accepted the implications of English tactical innovation. Future Spanish expeditions continued to emphasize traditional virtues of discipline, courage, and religious faith, while gradually incorporating some English innovations in ship design and gunnery technique. The process of adaptation proved incomplete and inadequate for the challenges that English naval power would continue to present throughout the following centuries. The mythological transformation of historical events served different purposes for different audiences, but all versions of the Armada story shared certain common elements that revealed fundamental truths about the relationship between power, religion, and national identity in early modern Europe. Both English and Spanish narratives emphasize divine intervention, heroic leadership, and the cosmic significance of events that might otherwise be interpreted as merely political or military conflicts. The archaeological evidence that has emerged from Armada wrecks around the Irish and Scottish coasts provides a more prosaic but equally fascinating perspective on these legendary events. Underwater excavations of Spanish ships have revealed the material reality behind the myths, bronze cannon of extraordinary craftsmanship, personal possessions of Spanish soldiers and sailors, navigational instruments that tell the story of Spanish attempts to find safe passage through unknown waters. The wreck of the Gallius Girona, discovered off the coast of Northern Ireland in the 1960s, yielded a treasure trove of artifacts that brought Spanish participants in the campaign back to vivid life. Gold and silver jewelry, religious medallions, eating utensils, and weapons provide intimate glimpses of the men who sailed with Philip's great enterprise. The quality and variety of these objects demonstrate the wealth and sophistication of Spanish society at its imperial zenith, while their location on the seabed tells the tragic story of Spanish dreams destroyed by northern storms. Modern historical scholarship has attempted to strip away layers of mythology and propaganda to reach more objective understanding of the Armada campaign and its significance. Careful analysis of Spanish and English archives has revealed the complex logistical, technological, and strategic factors that determine the campaign's outcome, while comparative study of 16th-century naval warfare has placed English innovations in broader historical context. These scholarly investigations have generally confirmed that English tactical advantages were real and decisive, while acknowledging that Spanish defeat was not inevitable and that different circumstances might have produced entirely different outcomes. The role of weather, while dramatic and historically significant, appears less determinative than earlier accounts suggested, while English superiority in ship design, gunnery, and seamanship emerges as more systematic and fundamental than Spanish sources were willing to admit. The Armada's place in the broader development of European naval warfare has become clearer as historians have studied the gradual transition from Mediterranean galley tactics to Atlantic sailing ship combat. The 1588 campaign represents a crucial moment in this technological and tactical revolution, demonstrating conclusively that traditional methods of naval warfare had become obsolete in the face of innovations that emphasized firepower, maneuverability, and professional seamanship over size, intimidation, and boarding tactics. The influence of the Armada campaign on subsequent naval development extends far beyond English and Spanish innovations to shape European maritime competition throughout the Age of Sail. Dutch, French, and other naval powers studied the lessons of 1588 and incorporated English tactical principles into their own naval doctrines, while Spanish attempts to counter English advantages drove continued innovation in ship design and gunnery technique. The global implications of Spanish naval decline and English maritime expansion, set in motion by the Armada's defeat, ultimately transformed the entire pattern of European colonization and commercial development. English dominance in North American colonization, English penetration of Asian trade networks, and English control of Atlantic slave routes all reflect advantages that the defeat of the Spanish Armada made possible. The cultural legacy of the Armada campaign resonates through literature, art, and popular memory in ways that transcend its immediate historical significance. Shakespeare's histories, written in the decade following the Armada's defeat, reflect English confidence and imperial ambition that victory over Spain had inspired. Marlowe's dramas explore themes of power, ambition, and divine justice that the Armada campaign had brought to the forefront of English consciousness. Spanish Golden Age literature, flourishing in the decades after 1588, often reflects themes of heroic failure and noble sacrifice that Spanish memory associated with the Armada campaign. Cervantes himself, veteran of Spanish naval service and participant in the earlier victory at Lepanto, understood the gap between chivalric ideals and military reality that the Armada's defeat had revealed so dramatically. The Armada story continues to fascinate modern audiences because it embodies universal themes about the relationship between human ambition and natural forces, between technological innovation and traditional values, between divine providence and historical causation. Every generation finds new meanings in the tale of Spanish hubris and English triumph, new lessons about the unpredictability of human affairs and the dangers of overconfidence in military planning. Contemporary climate research suggests that the storms which completed Spanish destruction may have been unusually severe even by North Atlantic standards, adding an element of exceptional bad luck to Spanish misfortunes that were already severe under normal circumstances. This scientific perspective neither diminishes English tactical achievements nor excuses Spanish strategic failures, but it does remind us that human plans must always contend with forces beyond human control. The enduring power of the Armada legend lies not in its historical accuracy, which scholars continue to debate and refine, but in its dramatic demonstration of how quickly and completely the balance of world power can shift when established methods meet revolutionary challenges. The story speaks to every age that faces the choice between adapting to change or clinging to traditions that may no longer serve. And so, as sleep overtakes you and your mind drifts away from these ancient battles, remember that the waves still break on Irish shores where Spanish ships once foundered, that the tides still turn in the English Channel where the fate of Europe was decided, and that somewhere in the darkness, the ghosts of sailors from both fleets continue their eternal voyage through the gray waters of history and memory. The Great Armada sailed into legend as much as into defeat, carrying with it dreams of empire and religious unity that would never again seem quite so possible or quite so necessary. In its failure, we see reflected all the hopes and fears of an age when the world seemed both infinite in its possibilities and terrifyingly uncertain in its destinations. The story ends not with victory or defeat, but with the timeless rhythm of wind and wave, carrying human ambitions toward shores that no chart has ever mapped and no navigator has ever reached.